warm welcome from me. For colleagues who don't know me, I think I know most people in the network, but I'm Helen Martin, one of the Gateway Alliance directors. It's lovely to see you today. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our English conference. Again, obviously online. It's a shame we can't be back together face to face, but obviously we are getting very used to needing to work in this way now, aren't we? Really delighted to welcome Charlotte and Farah, who will be leading the session this afternoon from CLPE, and I'll hand over to Ruth in just a second. She'll be able to say hello as well. Just in terms from myself, you're hopefully quite familiar with Zoom now. If you have any problems, please do pop those in the chat and I'll see if I can help you. The chat you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen on the menu bar there. And as I say, if you can keep your microphones muted during the session, that's brilliant. But if you can keep your cameras on, that's great as well. Just a quick heads up, this is our last meeting of the year for this academic year, but the English Network subscription is now available on the Gateway website for next academic year. So if you haven't already and you're keen to continue to work with us in terms of this network, then please do go and have a look and sign up. Just to give you a little bit of a flavour in terms of what's available through that subscription for next academic year. Obviously, we'll be meeting termly. We're sort of waiting to see whether those are going to be primarily online or there's going to be some face-to-face, but there will definitely be sort of a combination of the two. And we'll be having an English conference again as well, so that's to be expected. But 2 new features for next academic year are, one, Ruth and hopefully some experienced colleagues that work with us in terms of planning will be coming together for a termly surgery. So what's been difficult this academic year has been in terms of the networking and having that opportunity to catch either Ruth or a colleague over a coffee, either at coffee break or when you arrive. So we're hoping to be able to create quite an informal drop-in surgery session each term, which will follow the development meeting or conference. So it could have sort of a theme of focus, or it could be just that you're struggling with something in school and just want some time to chat that through with colleagues or with Ruth. So we're going to be introducing those next academic year, so look out for those. And also we're going to be setting up an online community, a closed online group. We're going to be using Facebook for that initially, because obviously that functionality is already there, but we do that for a couple of our other networks at the moment. So there's an opportunity for you to be able to be in touch with each other in between meetings. Ruth can be on there as well and answer any questions that you might have, or post on there any news or updates or information that would be useful to share between meetings as well. And so hopefully it'll keep that network communication going, as I say, between meetings. So hopefully those will add value to the network as well next academic year. But as I say, please do have a look on the website and subscribe if you're interested. I'm going to say no more. I'm going to hand over to Ruth so we can crack on with the session this afternoon. But thank you ever so much for being with us as well, Ruth, this afternoon. Over to you.
Like Helen, I don't want to speak for too long because I'm really excited about Charlotte and Farah being with us again this afternoon. Obviously, most of you, I imagine, will have been here for part 1, or I hope you were. So we're following up part 1 with a really full afternoon, another reason not to talk for too long, of engaging sessions around reading and writing and poetry, and just looking about, well, all I would want to say really is I've worked with the CLPE team for a number of years, and they are the English specialists turn to, and they are the people in the system at the moment who make sense, who have got the knowledge, who are interested in research and what really works to make children literate, because obviously literacy is such an important part of the English curriculum as it were in primary. So just so delighted to have them with us here again this afternoon, and I'm going to hand over to Charlotte or Farah, I don't know which.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It's always such a privilege to be working in the same space as Ruth. We mutually fangirl of one another, I think, because at the heart of everything that we do as practitioners is our desire to want the best for the children that we serve. And so it's really lovely to have the opportunity to work with like-minded folk on steering that. So yeah, as both Helen and Ruth alluded to there, it's a jam-packed session. So welcome everybody. I hope you've been keeping well since the last session. Hope you've got your fill of vitamin D, and that if not, you're sat near a window so that you can continue to benefit from that whilst we move through the session. In today's session, we've split it into 3 parts. In part 1, we're going to be thinking about text provision and how that text provision might shape our readers. So in the first session that we had together, we spent time giving you an overview of the research findings. And today it's very much thinking about how do you take those findings and translate them into practice. So the first part is going to be thinking about that in terms of shaping our readers. We'll take time for a comfort break, and then we'll come back for part 2. And in part 2, we'll be thinking about how we use poetry as a means of shaping our young writers. And then another comfort break, and then we'll come back together. And for the final part of the session, we'll be pulling together the components from the first and second part of the session to form the basis of an interactive writing workshop. It will help us to put into practice a lot of the things that we're going to be touching on in the first 2/3 of the session. So buckle in, make sure you've got water to hand, make sure you've got pen and paper to hand, and we'll get going. So part 1. Questions on the screen that you can see there are going to inform our thinking for this first part of the session. We're going to take each component and unpick that together. So in the first instance, we're thinking about how do we meaningfully integrate quality literature that centres characters of colour. So in the last session that we had together, I shared with you the kind of headline figures. And on the next slide, you'll see a kind of replication of one strand of the data, which specifically looked at the demographic makeup of representation across castes that we had encountered in the third set of submissions. So in the third report, looking at the caste makeup across all the titles that we looked at and thinking about what the ethnic representation of that caste makeup was. And so for the purposes of today's session, we're going to zoom in specifically to think about that category that we've circled there, thinking specifically about the Black demographic, but being mindful of the fact that the Black demographic is a very overarching umbrella and encompasses many heterogeneous communities within that context. But we're going to use that as a basis to really think about what representation looks like specifically within this demographic and thinking about how that shapes the impressions of the readers that we work with. Okay. So last time we were together, we reflected on the potential lack of presence of characters of colour in an average schools provision. And you might recall me sharing this sample of titles that you would typically encounter in Key Stage 1, all of which are great titles that we would absolutely be, keen to see sitting on the shelves in our Key Stage 1 classes. But you may recall that I'd asked you to have a glance at them and really think about where the presence was from a marginalized perspective, and you may recount that having looked at them, there was little to none in the Key Stage 1 sample there. I think with the exception of the tokenistic kind of nod on the front cover of Please Mrs. Butler. And again, when we looked at Key Stage 2, there was slightly more presence in the sample, but you may recall that we reflected that sample we only encountered presence in very specific components of that text range. So classically in the traditional tales section, and sometimes within the non-fiction section when we're looking at past civilizations. And you may recall us talking about the fact that in those instances, that can give a skewed impression to young children around, where we feel entitled to occupy literary spaces, So what we want and what we're really keen to be thinking about is how you ensure breadth and balance across text types, across year groups, across key stages, so that we are clear as young readers and developing readers that actually, there should be legitimate presence in all of those contexts, so that we're not getting any skewed impression around, limitations in that respect. So thinking about that, I want us to ponder a little bit around what the implications are for us in terms of curating that stock, selecting it, and also putting it to use, because there are tiers to this and we're going to be at different stages as schools. Some of us are going to be at the early stages of evaluating and auditing our book stock and thinking about, okay, what have we got? And in asking that question, determining the volume that you have, and determining where the gaps are. Now, the gaps might be in particular year groups, they may be in particular genres, and you may be surprised that in some instances you've got really great volume of books in different pockets of the school. So that may be where your gaps sit. Your gaps might sit in terms of text type. So it may be that you've got a decent level of representation and inclusivity in the literature that you've got on your bookshelves, but actually when you drill down, that balance doesn't occur across text types and it doesn't occur across genres. So then that would be the next level of consideration. It may be that you've got some variation across text types and genres, but you haven't got sufficient thematic variation. So it may be that you've got a disproportionate amount of texts that specifically focus on themes around subjugation or around struggle or around strife. So you've got loads of books, for example, around the civil rights movement. And that's where your kind of presence sits, but not so many books that center on just a good, adventure of a story or a bit of a fantasy or a bit of a comedy. So it may be that thematically there needs to be a reevaluation around that. And so it will vary. So the question on the screen there, like I said, we're thinking specifically about the African diaspora for the purposes of this conversation. And I want you to be thinking about your own book stock. And it may be that you're not particularly privy about the range of book stock across the setting. And if that is the case, then just be thinking about your classroom book stock. If, however, you are the literacy coordinator and you do have that oversight, be thinking about the balance across the piece and be thinking specifically about characters from the African diaspora of African heritage, and think about how true that statement is for you, and consider the value that it might add to the bookshelf in that respect. So just out of interest then, we'd love to hear where you're at in terms of the journey that I've just kind of expressed there. So do have a think about that statement on the screen there. Think about your own book stock. Think about the journey and the stage at which you feel that you're at, and do share either in the chat or unmute yourselves, because it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts. Any reflections about what the stock provision might look like when we're specifically thinking about characters from the African diaspora?
Hi, it's Claire.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, Farah. I've heard you talk a few times now, either here or with UKLA, so forget where I've heard you speak before, as it were. It's something that we've worked on here at our school, and certainly we've got a big book list that we want to purchase, but obviously budget is an issue for us, but we have looked at incorporating texts that we've discussed, or you've discussed with us, into our curriculum. So we've introduced Look Up into our year one curriculum using the CLPE, planning to support that as part of our learning provision. And in year 6 we've included the London Eye mystery. So there's still a bit of work to do, and there's certainly one of my colleagues in early years who was on the UKLA judging with myself for the youngest year group. Every time they think of a topic, she's like, no, I'm going back to Claire and I'm asking her, where do we find that, representation of the diversity? Because for us in our school here, we've got over 40 plus languages represented. Right. So it's really important that we have that representation and diversity. But it's definitely, we're further along the journey than we were at the beginning of the year, but I would say we've still got a bit of a way to go.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your honesty and for your reflections there. And it's lovely to hear you express it in those terms, that it is a journey. I think that's something that's really important to stress. The job of the teacher is never done. Even when we think it's done, it's never quite done. And so particularly in regard to this area, it won't ever, you'll get to a point where you feel better about it, but you won't ever get to a point when you think, okay, I can relax now. I don't think that's in the DNA of our profession, frankly. But the kind of, in terms of the trajectory of that journey, it's great that you are kind of having those conversations. It's great that it's at the forefront of your mind in terms of your considerations around text selection, because that's a really big step. For that to be kind of in the collective consciousness of the staff group is a really, really key kind of step in the right direction. And then in terms of longer term, it's knowing your starting points, because colleagues in the room will be at different points. So knowing where you're at, doing that kind of audit, but that audit not just being a one-off, once in a lifetime activity. It's going to be something that you're going to have to routinely reevaluate, you know, as part of your wider reevaluation of stock provision anyway. And then once you've got to a place where you've got a nice kind of cycle of replenishing titles so that they are representative, they are, you know, cultivating the best of what's currently out there, then the next step will be thinking about, okay, what do we do with this stock? How are we using this stock? Is it gathering dust on the shelf? You know, because it's so pretty and so new that we don't want any kids, you know, kind of playing with them? Or actually, are we using them? You know, are there, and in what ways are we using them? Which books are lending themselves really well for our Read Aloud program? Which books are going to, you know, sit really well as part of our core literacy teaching program? Which books might we use for our group reading sessions? Which books might just be really nice to recommend to kids? So all of the things that you guys are always thinking about in terms of putting the right book in the right place and in the right hands equally apply here. And like I say, please be mindful that this is absolutely a journey. And as long as you're on the road and, you know, you got you know, your packed lunch, because, you know, as teachers, we've got to have our packed lunch, and we've got the fuel to keep going, then that's the main thing, and you won't veer too far off in that respect.
There's a couple of good points in the chat there, Farah. Nicola and Lisa have both brought up, again, Claire brought up the point of having budget to keep replenishing it. It's always something you got to fight for as an English coordinator, isn't it? You need people to see that books are a renewable resource. You don't just spend on books and it's done, because there are new books every year. But Nicola and Lisa have both brought out the importance of subscribing to the school library service, because they're doing that for you every year. A really good school's library service is worth its weight in gold, and you'll be able to get that replenishment every term to be able to make sure that you've got a range and a wealth of different books.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think those are really important points. And I can also see in the chat there, Rebecca commenting on the efforts to really think about the breadth of balance of authorship as well, which I think is really, really crucial, because as Charlotte and I will touch on throughout the session, there's a real value to thinking about authors in terms of them as writing role models. And so having that range and breadth can be really empowering for children to kind of challenge misconceptions around who is and isn't allowed to occupy that literary space. I don't know if you remember from the first session that we had together, we touched on the two anecdotes of Vernon Hopkins and Darren Chetty talking about their kids in the primary phase of their education not feeling that books were a space for characters of colour, and feeling like if it was a proper book should feature a white cast and a white protagonist. So it's challenging those notions through the experience of texts and authors that we offer. So our reading diet and our menu, if you like, becomes really crucial to conveying those messages both implicitly and explicitly. So thank you so much for those comments. And absolutely, as Charlotte said there, you know, trying to acquire funds is always the kind of the key challenge for us in schools. So as well as really tapping into those school library services, if you've got the benefit of accessing those, do hold on to those to dear life, because the demand will reciprocate the necessity for those services. But also thinking about funding bodies like the Siobhan Endowed Trust, who routinely issue grants and gifting mechanisms to make sure that schools have access to books. So do seek out wider than those kind of sources as well for that purpose. But thank you for those considerations, and we'll continue to invite you to think more on this as we move through the session. So I want us to build on some considerations then. If we look at the statement there, I want us to build on the nuances of this statement as we've kind of begun to touch on in that opening there. We've talked about volume, and I want us to kind of delve a bit more deeply into the ramifications of a lack of volume. And then we'll continue then to think about text types, genres, and variation or portrayal in helping us to think about how we kind of steer that experience for our children. So let's start with volume in the first instance, okay? And we're going to start, this is the kind of classic exercise that I do with colleagues, just to kind of get them thinking about it. And because we are thinking specifically about African diaspora kind of demographic, we're going to frame it around that kind of thinking. So I want you to look at that scale there, and I want you to note in the chat a number from 1 to 5 to give us a sense of, on average, your children's knowledge base around the African continent. Okay, so it might be children that you're currently working with, or if you don't have a class at the minute, the class that you most recently worked with, or group of children you most recently worked with. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being that they have a broad and deep knowledge and understanding of the continent, 5 being that they don't have any knowledge at all, where might your children sit? Okay, that's great. I can see the numbers coming through the chat there. That's great. Okay. Awesome. Not awesome that we're at that number, but awesome that we're getting that through. Okay. That's really interesting. I find it so fascinating posing this question because wherever I pose it around the country, the average numbers are always the same. It's very, very rare to get anywhere above 3 on that scale. The average tends to sit in the 3/4 realm, which is the average of this group here. So what I want you to do is hold that number in your head. So we're saying that on average, the pupils that we work with, and this is an average that's reflected across the UK because we deliver training all over the country and beyond actually, and that tends to be the average. If we're saying that the average is that pupils know some to very little facts about the African continent, let's hold that kind of average on the scale in our head, and let's look at a couple of illustrations to unpick what these particular titles might do to add to the knowledge base and move those children up the scale. Okay, so our first one, okay, which is a classic that everybody will be familiar with, and a copy of which I'm sure will be in every early years classroom around the country. It's been going strong for over 25 years now. I want you to look at this spread, and I want you to consider what you notice and what your observations might suggest about this place. Okay, so pull out any details that kind of draw your attention, and what might that suggest? What might you infer from that observation about this place? And again, feel free to unmute yourselves or comment in the chat, whichever's easy for you. So what do we notice? What might we infer? So we can infer that we can observe that it's a warm climate. So the real warmth that the image exudes generally, yeah. Fruits, a suggestion of exotic, it must be a hot place, it's bright, it's colourful, absolutely, very vibrant image. What else do we notice in the image? And what might it help us to infer about this place? Right, so Hannah's tapped in there and is mentioning that she can't see any roads. So that's a flip. So we might say that what are we noticing, and then an extension of the conversation might be, and what are we missing? What's missing from the image? So we've got no roads and no pavements. So based on that observation, what might we infer about this space? We can see wild animals. Hannah's thrown in there, so it may infer that this isn't a city or town. We may infer that there is a lack of infrastructure in this space. Yeah. Any other observations? Got exotic wildlife, a number of you picked up on. She's alone. Where is her family? Yeah. It's a very rural context. Yeah, absolutely. And we could do a compare and contrast for sure. Okay. So take on those, kind of hold on to those observations. And now I'm going to show you another spread. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to talk about what we notice, and we're going to reflect on what that observation, what we're able to observe, infer from those observations. Okay, so hold on to that. Now, if we were together, we'd probably have these images on the table, and I'd have you scribbling all over them so that we could, have a kind of tangible set of notes around it. But let's look at the next one. Okay, what do we notice, and what might we infer from those observations? So a lot more going on actually in this image that you could pick up on, but what do we notice and what might we infer? Right, so thank you for starting us off there, Claire. We've got a city, we've got a family unit, we've got a seaside setting, so it's a coastal setting, quite a contrast, but busy family life, lots of energy in that scene, definitely. We can infer from the fact that it's set on a beach that there is a coastline. We've got a cityscape in the background that Francis has picked up on there. We've got the boats, we've got the fishing that's going on in the background. Yeah, we've got the heat that's coming through, definitely. Okay. Brilliant. Has more of a contemporary air about it, definitely, Claire. And then we'd probably delve a bit deeper in that. We'd say, okay, what is it that's making you think this feels more modern? You know, what are the details that are suggesting that this is more of a contemporary kind of context or setup? You know, and with the kids, what we might do is one colour for observations, and then a second colour for what those observations are telling us or suggesting to us. And then maybe another colour about what would we like to find out? What questions does it inspire? What more do we want to know? Yeah, definitely nice energy, really excited to be on that beach. Yeah, absolutely. And now we're beginning to delve into the dynamics on you know, on the page in terms of the distance between the child and the rest of the family unit and why that might be. Absolutely. So we're getting into the story now. So thinking about that then, and coming back to that scale then, I want you to take a moment to think about how the two spreads compare and contrast, and think about that scale. So we said that on average, the pupils that we're working with probably sit on 3 or 4 of that, you know, on average at 0.3 or 4 of that scale. I want you to think about how do the two spreads compare and contrast, and to what extent do either of those two titles move us on that scale? Do they move us up or down? Do they keep us in the same point on that scale? And in what ways? So again, feel free to unmute or just share in the chat any thoughts. How do they compare and contrast? And how does the experience of those two spreads impact on where we sit on that scale? Any thoughts? Yeah, so thanks for kicking us off, Jane. Hand is definitely coming from a more stereotypical kind of perspective. I mean, to be fair, it's over 25 years old now. And at the point of publication, it was quite groundbreaking because it was published at a time when it was very rare to encounter characters of colour. I can also fully appreciate the value that it adds in terms of teaching and learning opportunities. You know, you've got your fruit salad thing going on, you've got your counting going on, you've got your sequencing going on. All of those kind of things are really valuable learning experiences for our children. But in terms of representation, it's quite dated, it's quite stereotypical, and it harks back to this idea of Africa as this generic space, not a space that's, you know, has multiple countries, not a space that's a continent, not a space that's particularly developed, and that kind of hut idea of, you know, we all kind of live in the middle of nowhere in vacant landscapes, and we all live in huts and walk around with fruit on our head. So it does kind of veer back to that kind of stereotype. But I'm thinking about some of the comments that are coming through here. I think that's really interesting. So Hannah talks about the fact that Hannah's surprise reinforces the views that children might already have about Africa. So thinking about that scale point, it doesn't really shift us very much. So if we're already starting from a low part of that scale point, it doesn't really build on our knowledge base. And if anything, it reinforces any limited impressions that we might have, definitely. And yeah, might also be compounded by other art forms such as Disney films that they will have kind of experienced and encountered, definitely. I'm just thinking, what else have we got here? Yeah, there's a variation in locations, and I think that's really, really important. And variation in terms of interaction. You've got a soul child in the first one, whereas you've got a wealth of intergenerational activity happening in the second one, which gives us a window into thinking about family dynamics, community dynamics, and society makeups. So again, thinking about that scale, if we're sitting on the 3 and 4 end of that scale, it might shift a little bit because we may not fully appreciate what societal dynamics might look like in this part of the world. We want to fully appreciate the fact that in this part of the world, they have beaches and cities as much as they have, you know, fields and savannas, you know, so it's broadening their knowledge base and it's refining their insight. So thank you so much for those contributions there. Really, really lovely to see your reflections and your thoughts. And the takeaway point here, and I think this is key, and I say this every time, because Eileen Brown is a lovely lady, and you know, I don't want to kind of disparage Handa's surprise entirely. So the takeaway point isn't that you march down to the reception class and whip out Handa's surprise and burn it. Absolutely not. The takeaway point is Handa can sit quite happily on the shelf as long as Handa sits alongside titles like Splash that you can see there by Atunuke. And actually, Atunuke is a really important contributor to the children's literary landscape. She is a part Welsh, part Nigerian storyteller. And her Anna Hibiscus series is, I think, should sit very firmly on every early years and early Key Stage 1 kind of bookshelf across the country. She's quite prolific, so she's written for all key stages, early years, Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. And if you don't know of her work, I would strongly recommend that you seek her out, buy her entire back catalogue and make it sit in the right parts of the school. She's got some great early readers for Key Stage 1, and she's also got some great titles, short chapter titles for Key Stage 2 as well as some non-fiction work that is great that we'll reference a bit later. So it's not Handa gone forever, it's Handa can stay as long as Handa sits alongside Anna and other titles of that ilk, so that children get that breadth of experience and get those misconceptions kind of challenged really early on. Because what we want is for children to gain insights into the varied landscapes, such as the savannah that you'll see in the next spread there by Ella Bailey Smith. And that's a Key Stage 1 title. Really gives you a nice kind of insight into life in the savannah, through to a range of rural contexts, from somewhere like the Kenyan Greenbelt, which is a great non-fiction title titled Mama Miti, that gives you an opportunity to encounter the work of this phenomenal environmentalist and the work that she's done around improving the climate in that part of the world, and the learning that then has had across the world in terms of how we ensure regeneration through planting of trees. Through to family farms. This is another Atunuke title. So you do want the rural, but you just want that balance of rural versus urban versus, you know, savannah and so on. Through to the mountainous regions of Morocco in this title here by Jeannie Baker. Because what that's giving us is an impression of the variation of the continent and an understanding of the fact that it is a continent made up of a number of countries with a number of landscapes, a number of climates, a number of societies, ideologies, beliefs, politics, society. And so you want that to come through in terms of the diet of titles that children consume. Through to the hustle and bustle of marketplaces from West Africa, like this particular title here, again by Atunuke, through to marketplaces in North Africa and Egypt, so that you're getting a sense of what, you know, marketplaces might look like in different parts of the continent. Through to coastal settings like the one that we just shared with you. This is the end paper of Splash there. What her partnership with Lauren Tobias is particularly nice, the illustrator for these titles, because there's a real careful consideration around the detail to really give you an impression of life in this space and the variation of lived experiences in this space. Through to busy, bustling cityscapes in Uganda, like this title, published by Lantana, and it's called Sibra and Saba Go to Sleep. Through to compounds. So this is the next one is Anna Hibiscus' song. So Anna Hibiscus is from a middle-class background. It gives you an insight into the socioeconomic makeup of Nigeria, and it gives you an experience of different lived experiences in that space. So that by the time children have left us in year 6, they're coming out the other end of that process, having had a real rich variation of experiences through the literature in that way. So you've got the nightlife here. Sorry, I can't stop talk enough about Atanuke. I just kind of, any opportunity, I just wish to put that spread in. But yeah, you can just see the detail there. You know, that's the other kind of end of that title there. As well as non-fiction titles like Africa, Amazing Africa, which is a great non-fiction title, recently published, I think it was published last year, that gives you a true appreciation, and this one again was written by Atanuke, but gives you an appreciation of the sheer breadth of countries, cultures, languages, and societies that make up the continent. So the ideal being that by the time we leave year 6, we are full to the brim of rich experiences through literature. Because ultimately, when you go back to the English programs of study and think about that national curriculum, from the very first paragraph, it's saying to us, we have an ethical, moral, and kind of principle kind of aim to ensure, or expectation to ensure, that by the time the children leave us, they have experienced that rich breadth and variation of literature. So they are well read, and they have an appreciation for that breadth. And I think as part of those considerations, as Claire said earlier, this is just another element of consideration in terms of stock curation and in terms of thinking about, okay, what do we do with that? So having considered what volume affords us, I now want us to go back to the opening provocation there and hone in on the points regarding text type. So we thought about volume, let's now think about text type. Now, the CLPE reading and writing scales have been devised to help us think about development of our children as readers and writers. Many of you who've worked with us before will be familiar with these, and these form the base of our understanding of what that reading and writing journey looks like, as well as considerations around how we help children at each stage of that journey to be secure in each phase and evolve onto the next. And threaded throughout that is a consideration of the stock that we use to cultivate a love of reading, the stock that we use to equip our children with the skills and knowledge necessary to become confident and competent readers. So as Teresa Kremen talks about the skill and the will, we're constantly playing the dance between those two things, thinking about which books are going to best serve our children in developing that skill set, and which books are going to best serve to keep them keep them resilient enough to stick with that journey. Because that's it's an ever winding road, and we as a group of literate adults know the benefits, but when you're on the road at the early stages, it can feel very overwhelming. And so you need books that are going to speak to the kids, that are going to help them feel like, yes, I want to stick with this because I love the experience of that particular title, I love the world of that particular book, or I have a connection with that particular character. So we're going to think about that a little bit now in terms of how that supports our thinking in terms of curating reading spines, okay? And part of our thinking around that needs to be around ensuring that the text provision reflects the realities of our pupil population and broadens the outlook of all readers in our setting. So on the next slide, you'll see a sample of what that might look like. So as I said from the outset, today we're specifically thinking about African diaspora in this context, okay? So if we're thinking about that just within this context, we need to be thinking about, okay, to what extent across the different text types that we're wanting our children to experience and explore is their presence? And then to what extent does that presence, is that presence sustained across the year groups? You know, you don't want one year group's book corner to be fantastically well stocked, but then there to be a dip in the subsequent years group's stock. You want a consistency across the piece. And ensuring that consistency, we are also thinking about not just the volume, as we just touched on, but also the quality of the portrayals within those titles. You know, Handa can stay because Anna Hibiscus is there. If Anna Hibiscus wasn't there, I'd be questioning whether or not Handa can stay, you know. So it's thinking about the balance across the piece. So we would hope that in early years, a review of the book stock would reveal presence in a rich variation of texts with linguistic and thematic content that would complement the prime areas of learning and development. So, you know, we wear multiple hats as teachers. We're always thinking about, okay, how's that going to fit with our learning objectives? How's that going to fit with our themes, with our topics? How's that going to fit with the learning program? How's that going to fit with the reading program? How's that going to fit with that particular child? Which title is going to speak to them? So this is just one extra strand of consideration to ensure that the stock is out there. You know, there are books increasingly coming through. We're not in the same place that we were at, say, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago. There is increasingly a really good volume of literature coming out. Some of it's amazing and some of it's not so great. And that's where it becomes really crucial that we as professionals take the time to apply our critical eye to that content to determine what's going to work well. So this is just one example of what that spread might look like, thinking about African diaspora content within the earlier setting. And then the next thing, a number of you said you're in the kind of auditing phase, you got a sense of where you're at with your book stock. The next phase, as I said, is thinking about, okay, what do we do with it once we've got it? So if we take the next slide, once you've got a really rich range of stock at your disposal, you will immediately as teacher, because this is your bread and butter, will know, okay, that's going to work really well there. That's going to work really well for this learning topic or for this group reading group and so on. So you take a book like Jabari Tries and immediately you can see the scope that a title like that, oh, it's flipping. Is that just my screen? We go back to Jabari Tries for a second, Charlotte, that would be great. Yeah, it gives us the scope to really kind of think about understanding of the world, you know, building on the themes of flight, because in Jabari Tries, the whole premise of the book is Jabari trying to figure out how he might model and design something that flies. And you've got, you know, the challenges that come with that, the resilience that's necessary, the trial and error that comes with that. So it's a perfect early years title because it gives us the scope to really kind of enter that space and connect with that space, because our kids will be in that kind of mind frame. In Key Stage 1, you'd hopefully find ample quality representative titles, again, across all text types that feature some of the ones that are like featured on the screen. If we go to the next slide, Charlotte, that'd be great. So again, same kind of consideration. What are the text types? What's the range? What's the extent of presence? What's the variation of presence? And then again, how are we using those titles? And what's the quality of those portrayals, you know? Because once you've done that thinking, again, you can extract any one of those titles and do a really interesting unit of work. So if we take Splash, because I mentioned Splash and we touched on it with the hand of surprise comparison, a book like Splash, again, fantastic opportunities for some really meaningful cross-curricular work that not only gives the children the opportunity to really enjoy the story, to enjoy Anna's adventures on the beach, but also to broaden their insights and learning and understanding of this part of the world. Now, Atunuke never really talks about it necessarily being Nigeria, and we know that in Nigeria inspires it. She talks about it in terms of Africa, amazing Africa, but we can take enough cues that it would give us the means to kind of explore Nigeria as an area of study, and everything that I pulled up there on the screen will resonate and connect with the curriculum expectations in that phase. So we're doing this work. It may feel like it's more work, but it isn't, because we're doing this work all of the time as practitioners. We're always thinking about, get the right book, think about what it might inspire, and off we go. This is just another tier of consideration. What more could this book offer us in terms of explorations around representation and inclusivity? And then finally, you would be moving into Key Stage 2, and again, you'd want the same kind of thing. You'd want to be able to be able to say with confidence that across the piece and across the different text types, there is real scope and opportunity to have that variation of experience. And similarly, If we take the Mamma Miti, and I've deliberately gone for kind of books there that you could do some really interesting cross-curricular work around history, around geography, and all of the other aspects, particularly if you take that integrated approach. And if you take a book like Mamma Miti, you can see again the richness of opportunity. Not only will this elevate their literacy learning, but it will elevate their learning across the piece and actually give us the opportunity to really get them thinking about literacy within each subject area. So, you know, what it means to be a kind of a historian and literate in that discipline, you know, with the set of skills necessary to undertake the work in that part of the curriculum, how that might translate in terms of geography, how that might translate in terms of being a scientist, and so on and so forth. So it gives a real scope to do that meaningfully. These are not token gestures. These are actually elevating the standard and the quality of learning that's happening in our classrooms. And it's through the use of the right book. Yes, Nicola, absolutely. I really want to write a teaching sequence for that one. So that's Children of Kingdom of Benin. I think that would be on point in terms of ancient civilization and hitting that component of the Key Stage 2 history aspect. And that would be another really good example of that. And if that's sat with Mamma Miti, and it's sat with Splash, and it's sat with all the other titles that we talked about, what you end up getting is a real variation of ancient civilization through to contemporary times. So you've got that breadth. So what you're doing is literally shifting children's understanding in quite profound ways. Okay, so for the last part of this segment, we're going to think about the second question there. So we've spent quite a bit of time there thinking about how we meaningfully integrate quality literature that centres characters of African heritage in this instance. To wrap up this segment, I want us to now think about how we might use literature to challenge thinking and develop skills of critical reflection, because we're not always going to have the perfect book. And when we don't have the perfect book, we have to think about how we support children in unpicking its imperfections, because that's the kind of thing that's going to get them really grounded in the critical thinking that we want them to be able to take on moving forward in their education to Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. So to help us do that, we're going to share with you a classic title, so some extract from a classic title, and we want you to have a little think about the different perspectives we might view this title from. Okay, so I'm going to read aloud the extract, and then I'm going to invite you to consider the extract from two different perspectives. So in the first instance, just relax and I'll read aloud, and you can follow on the screen, and then we'll have a conversation about how we might unpick this from two different perspectives. So, Oompa Loompas, imported direct from Loompa-land, and oh, what a terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungles infested by the most dangerous beasts in the world, hornswogglers and snozzwangers, and those terrible wicked wangdoodles. A wangdoodle would eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for a second helping. They had to live in tree houses to escape from the one-doodles. The one food they longed for was the cacao bean, but they didn't get it. I climbed up to their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow, looking thin and starved, was sitting there. Look here, I said, if you and your people will come back to my country and live in my factory, you can have all the cacao beans you want. So I shipped them all over here, every man, woman and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They were wonderful workers. They all speak English now. Okay, so that's an extract taken from Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And what I want us to do is I want us to review the title from two perspectives. The first perspective being the lens of the narrator, and the second perspective being the perspective of the Oompa Loompas themselves, okay? So let's think about it from lens one, okay? So if you look at the screen, you can look at the text again that I've just shared with you. I want you to consider the questions that you can see on the screen. So I want you to consider, from whose perspective do we learn about Loompa-land? I want you to reflect on what the limitations of this perspective might be. And I want you to consider the language choices. So what do the narrator's language choices suggest about their impression of Loompa-land? and which details in the passage might indicate the self-serving nature of this. Now, obviously, time is limited in this instance. If we were with the children, we'd be taking each of these strands individually with a different coloured pen and spending time over each point, you know, at a time, and building our reflections as we go. So have a look at the text on the screen. Think about this first lens that we're looking at it from, and think about the questions on the screen there. And again, unmute yourselves or add to the chat any thoughts, initial thoughts about that extract. Any thoughts? If it's easier to unmute, please do so. But otherwise, I'd be interested to hear your reflections.
I just think I've read this book so many times, and I've got a 5-year-old myself who's sort of read it twice already, or we've read it to him, and I've never really thought about it from this perspective, this particular part of the text, and actually I'm now sort of wondering whether the poor Oompa Loompas were taken against their will. You know, it's almost like they're being looked down on. They've been sort of made to speak English. Was it really that bad for them, or was that Willy Wonka's perspective of what it was like in Lumperland? And when you start to think of it in that way, it's really interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think it is really fascinating, because in the pre-1973 version of this book, the Oompa Loompas were called African pygmies, and it wasn't until the kind of the publication, the re-edition of it, that they decided in 73 or 76 that they would alter that to Oompa Loompa as opposed to African, because it was deemed not appropriate. And also the drawings changed. So in pre-73, 76 editions, they were drawn, the Oompa Loompas were drawn as African village people with straw skirts. And then after the 70s edition, they changed that to be more of the kind of orange random. Well, no, they changed in the book to being white individuals, and in the films, obviously, we had the kind of film adaptations that did this kind of orange green head situation. But it is really interesting, and I think a number of you have picked up the language choices: the starved, the terrible, the infested. And with the children, I would start with the language. You know, okay, let's underline or circle any of the words or phrases that help us to understand what the narrator thinks about this space. And then in underlining and circling in that way, what does that suggest to us about what they think? And then what kind of language? So some of you picking up, it's quite negative language, it's quite derogatory language. The other point I think somebody's picked up in the chat is you don't hear the Oompa Loompas say anything. Everything we are being told about in that respect. So you'd want to elicit those kind of responses. Some schools have chosen not to stock this particular title subsequent to thinking about this. But actually, I think there's a value in keeping it in stock and using it as a medium for unpicking some of the ways in which bias, prejudice and kind of problematic portrayals can play out, and get the children to really unpick that, and really reflect on that in that respect. Brilliant. So with that in mind, then we're going to move to the second lens. Okay, so that was lens one. Now, if you look at the next slide, sorry, we've got some prompts there to help us think about this extract again, but this time from the lens of the Oompa Loompas, from their perspective. So again, take a moment to look at the questions on the screen there, and feel free to unmute and contribute verbally or in the chat, but be thinking about what is the impact of not being informed of the names of the individual members of the tribe. We're never once told the tribe member's name or any of the individuals that are referenced. They're always referenced either as tribe, woman, man, child, never as named individuals. So what's the impact of that? How might hearing from an Oompa Loompa broaden our knowledge of Lumperland? How might the tribe leader have viewed the visitor? So we know what the visitor felt, but we don't know very much about what the tribe leader felt or thought. How might the tribe members have felt about this trade agreement? Because again, we don't get the opportunity to learn what their perspective on this is. And how might how might hearing from an Oompa Loompa, I can't even do this, vary our impression of the chain of events? So how might having this perspective shift our impression of the chain of events that have been narrated by lens one? So coming through, you've got lack of individuality, you've got, it makes it harder to connect, to empathize or to see them as human, because they're one step removed, because they haven't been named, they haven't been individualized in that way. That vagueness of language dehumanizes them, absolutely, Nicola. And so connection is key. For the purposes of humanity, connection is key. And if we fail to make connection, that's where we fall short. That's where you get atrocity. That's where you get injustice. That's where you get prejudice. So that's really powerful, I think. So thank you so much for your contributions there. And I could do a whole session just on that, and we could just spend ages going back and forth on that. And I'd love to really have heard more, but obviously we're wanting to make this as jam-packed a session for you as possible. So having had the opportunity to critically engage with this extract, we want you to use those things, those initial thoughts and those reflections that you will have been having as part of this, to be thinking about the prompts on the screen there, and to be thinking about that in terms of all of the books that you intend to share with the children. So I think we always having at the forefront of your mind, what do we want them to engage? What do we want them to gain from engaging with a text? And what kind of skills do we want them to hone when we are, really driving that critical reflection and engagement? And how might those skills benefit them beyond a session? So having sessions like that, where we're unpicking sometimes great portrayals, sometimes problematic portrayals, how does that then seep through in terms of their development as learners more broadly? Because ultimately the power of literacy gives them the scope to become more articulate, to become more considered, to become more critically reflective, and the application of that skill set across curriculum areas primes them to be the best learner that they can be. And that's what's really, really exciting about this. So as a wrap up for this segment of the session, you'll have these prompts to go away with. And these prompts essentially frame everything that we've said, from thinking about what we've got through to what do we do when we know what we've got, and how do we optimize those titles in a way that is going to prime them to be the most engaged and the best readers that they can be. So thank you so much for your participation in that first part of the session. We're now going to go for a 10-minute, and we mean 10 minutes, because if you thought that was busy, you should wait until you see what we're doing next. But if you come back for 10 minutes, so quickly go grab yourself something to drink, and we'll see you here at 2:10.
We're going to move into the next session now. Feeding back on the evaluations that you sent through last time, there were some requests for poetry. So we're going to follow through the thread that Farah started off by looking at, yes, what poetry is, and learning from the research we know about poetry in primary schools and practice and provision that supports the effective teaching of poetry. But we're also going to look at how to follow through on what Farah said about building that spine, making sure that our children experience a range and breadth of poetry as they move through their primary years. That's not just in the sense of the types of poetry they're looking at, but it's the types of authors, the types of poets that they experience, and making sure that every child can see themselves in the poetry that they experience throughout their primary school career. Just as a bit of background, if you don't know already, at CLPE, we are also the National Poetry Centre for primary schools, and we hold that important role and take that really seriously. And in that role, we aim to highlight the vital importance of poetry on children's developing literacy through all of the research and development programmes that we offer. What we want to do is empower teachers in what evidence-based effective teaching of poetry looks like. And we do that through our webinars, through our course programme, through our teaching sequences that we provide for schools, and also through the video resources that we provide as well. Our literacy library, which you can see poet Michaela Morgan standing in a corner of there, houses both an in-print and a huge archive collection of poetry as well, to showcase what a good range of published children's poetry looks like to all of our library users. And our core books list online does the same in a virtual sense. So if you can't get to that library in London, do look at our core books website, because that will show you a range and breadth of poetry. Our Power of Poetry research project, which we ran in 2017 to 18, and it was funded by the Arts Council England, highlighted the importance of poetry as a vehicle for improving children's engagement in and enjoyment of reading and creative writing in schools. We also run the CLPE, and that's the Centre for Literacy in Primary Poetry Award. I have to say that very carefully, it's quite a mouthful. And that is the only award for published poetry for children in the UK. And in that middle photo on the screen there, you can see poet Stephen Camden, who won the 2019 award for his collection, Everything All at Once. That award encourages and it celebrates outstanding poetry published for children, but it also enables children to participate in poetry through our Associated Children's Shadowing Scheme. That's where children perform a poem from one of the shortlisted collections, and they submit a video entry to be judged by the CLPE panel of judges. And the winners there, as you can see this young man on the screen in that last photo, get to perform at our annual award show in front of an audience of poets and invited guests. We usually host that award at that ceremony at the National Theatre down in London, but because of COVID, we haven't been able to do that last year or this year. We're actually partnering up with the Cheltenham Festivals, and we're having an awards ceremony this year in October as part of the Cheltenham Literature Festival. As well as the library and the award, we also host the Poetry Line website. That's a free site containing a really extensive range of resources to help teachers teach poetry in primary schools. On that website, you can access over 250 films of well-known children's poets, reading their poems, talking about their work. We provide teaching sequences for the poetry books that have been shortlisted for the CLPE Award throughout the primary age range. And we give you examples of practice from primary schools that have engaged with our poetry programmes and our shadowing scheme at CLPE as well. I should put a caveat here. We're actually launching a new website in the next couple of weeks. So if you log in a little bit later than today, the website will look very different. You can see on the screen the website as it looks now, but we are in a transition period and it might look different the next time you log in. So we're going to start this session by taking a look at what the evidence says about the teaching of poetry in primary schools. And then we're going to move to build on that by exploring what quality practice and provision in the teaching of poetry might look like across a school. Now, our work with teachers, children and poets over the last 40 years has given us a real wealth of knowledge and understanding about teaching poetry in primary schools. In our work across the country, we see again and again and again what an important branch of literature poetry is. However, and as you probably recognise in your own schools, there have been challenges regarding that tension between the curriculum expectations and engagement with poetry and the assessment focuses and the assessment requirements and poetry. And that's really been shown throughout our work to affect teachers' confidence in bringing poetry to life in the classroom. This hasn't really been helped by the fact that Ofsted haven't done a full review of poetry and poetry in the primary classroom since 2006-7. Back then, they found that because the value of poetry was well recognised and well valued, both in the national curriculum and in the primary literacy strategy, which is in place at the time, all pupils got to experience poetry. They got to read it, they got to write it. Most of them enjoyed it. And most teachers knew that active approaches contributed to that enjoyment of poetry. However, they also found that provision for poetry was much weaker than other aspects of English inspected, and that poetry remained an area for development. They found that this was because many teachers lacked subject knowledge, and that was also reflected in the limited range of poems that were studied in the classroom. They found that classic poems and poems from other cultures were very rarely studied, and too many of the poems chosen for children lacked sufficient challenge in taking them forward in their reading or either in their knowledge about writing. One of the big problems was that a lot of the time when they saw poetry being written, it was a task where pupils were asked to imitate a poem that was already there, or that topics were prescribed for children. Write a poem about light, write a poem about growing. And that left very little scope for children to explore their own feelings and experiences, which is what lies at the root of writing good poetry. And they found that that limited pupils' original writing. Now, that continues to be an ongoing challenge. Ofsted's informal commentary on their Phase 1 curriculum review in 2018 also mentioned that narrowing of the primary English curriculum, and it provided anecdotal evidence that less poetry was taught because the curriculum narrowed in Key Stage 2. What we found through our work on the Power of Poetry research project is that teachers benefit from being readers of poetry and having those opportunities to share responses to poems read. That's when we really get to understand what poetry is and what poetry is for, by engaging in it with a deeper level of reader response, by being able to bring our personal connections to poems and being able to talk about poems as a group of readers, learning from the experiences of others. We also found that teachers benefit from the opportunity to see themselves as writers of poetry. This is something that we've also carried forward into our newest poetry research programme, Poetry in the Primary Classroom, on which we're partnering with the Royal African Society. And as part of that project, we're getting teachers to keep their own poetry journals and to write poems of their own as we go along the course. In that way, you can see what writing poetry is for. You can see the challenges in writing poetry, and with it, hand in hand, you can learn a lot of lessons about how to teach writing in the classroom and the best ways to facilitate children's original writing in the classroom. Not to scare you off from coming back after the next comfort break, but our final session today is going to be a writing workshop where we're going to take you through the process of shaping, of crafting a poem of your own, to go away and present to a larger audience. One of the other things that we found was that teachers had quite limited knowledge of poets, poems and forms, and they felt they needed much more access to training and to resources that help them expand on that. If we link that to the National Literacy Trust poetry survey, which was done in 2020, what they found was that a teacher is the main source of encouragement for children to create poetry in their spare time for over half of the young children and people that were surveyed. The next amount was that parents or carers encouraged them to create poetry, but also 1 in 5 children there told us that they were self-directed and had no one encouraging them to write or perform poetry. So what we need to think about is how are we creating those contexts for engaging with poetry across children's primary years, and how are we supporting our own subject knowledge and our own personal development to be able to facilitate children's engagement and enjoyment of poetry. None of these findings that we found about teachers as readers and teachers as recommenders of poetry are new things. Back in 2009, when Teresa Kremen did her original Teachers as Readers research, she also found that whilst the majority of teachers read independently for pleasure, professionally they were relying on a very limited canon of children's authors, and particularly what came to the forefront was the narrow range of the picture fiction creators and the poets. That's why we've chosen to focus on picture books in the first session with you and poetry in this second session with you, because as with other kinds of children's literature, it's really important that as facilitators of learning and as educators, we have a really good knowledge of the range and breadths of poets and poetry available for that primary age range. It's really important that we also introduce children to a really wide range and breadth of poetry so that they can be introduced to new poets, new voices, new styles that they might not meet through their own reading. So it's worth us taking a minute now to consider with our staff teams when we go back into school how confident they are in naming and recommending poets and poetry to share with the readers in your school, and how much poetry you have on offer to children in your book corners and in your selections across the curriculum, and for free choice in their independent reading as well. In 2017, as I said before, we were funded by the Arts Council to run a research project, The Power of Poetry, and it was evaluated by Professor Andrew Lambeth at the University of Greenwich. With that project, we were aiming to look back at that Ofsted review of poetry and to investigate and discover the impact of quality teaching of poetry in primary schools in the present educational climate. On the screen now, you can see our pre-course evaluation data from the teachers involved, and we found that there was a real variation in the confidence levels of participants in teaching poetry. Those that weren't confident at the beginning of the course really cited the lack of CPD in this area. They hadn't had training in initial teacher training programs, they hadn't experienced teaching poetry in placements, and they hadn't, since walking into the classroom, received a great amount of CPD that was specifically focused on poetry. They also looked at that lack of clarity into how poetry fits with the assessment frameworks and expectations. Also, something important to note was that many of the teachers who said they weren't confident were also put off of poetry by an over-analytical response in their own secondary school experience. And that really affected their views of how to best deliver poetry in their own primary classrooms. It's not all doom and gloom there, because throughout the project year, we worked with the teachers on developing their knowledge of children's poets and poetries, and in the approaches and activities they could develop in the classroom, as well as gap tasks that were focused on reading and applying research in the classroom as well. And by the end of that project year, we saw a huge shift in the confidence levels of the teacher involved. And the project evaluator, Andrew Lambeth, praised the quality of the CPD, the resources, the gap tasks, and stated that there was plenty of evidence that the teachers benefited from the programme, and it had and would continue to create a really positive impact on their practice. So we're going to aim throughout this part of the session to share some of that research with you, and to engage you in some of the activities that really made a mind shift to the teachers and built their confidence in bringing poetry to their own classrooms. So I just want to start us off with thinking about where our touch base is here with our own knowledge of poets and poetry. So take a few minutes to just think about, which children's poets do you know? Which poems or collections have you used in the classroom? Have there been any particularly that have been successful, both from your own teacher perspective or ones that children have picked up and children have enjoyed? And let's have a little straw poll on how confident we feel about teaching poetry. I'm going to draw on the methodology that Farah used in the last session, and let's do this on a kind of 1 to 5. Can we paste in the chat on a 1 to 5 scale, with 1 being really, really confident and 5 being not confident at all, how confident we feel about teaching poetry in our primary classrooms? And then feel free to chip in, either by unmuting or once again in the chat. Which children's poets do you know? Which poems or collections have you used and do you feel confident about using in the classroom? So once again, can see those 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s coming through in the classroom already. We've got some 2s in there, which is really brilliant. We've got quite a few 2s at the end of here. Most people are going exactly the same average as we did with the Knowledge of Africa, 3s and 4s, which don't worry at all. Wherever we do this in the country, most people say they are a 3 or a 4 at teaching poetry. If anyone wants to expand on their answer and just drop in the chat why it is that they feel they're at that point. Did any of those issues that I talked about with the children with the teachers that came through our research project resonate with you. For example, Nicola's just dropped straight in on the chat saying she knows she needs more knowledge and breadth of poetry. Thanks, Amy, for sharing Mallory Blackman's Cloud Busting. That's a brilliant verse novel that you can share. Jane's talking about Clement Clark Moore. Claire's talking about depending on the year group. Yeah, you might feel more confident about teaching poetry in one year group rather than another. Oh, Leah's talking about using Shakespeare's sonnets, The Lost Words by Robert Macfarlane and Mallory Blackman again. James picking up again on needing that wider knowledge of authors and poets. Jane linking back to Revolting Rhymes. Claire, What is Pink by Christina Rossetti. We've got some great classic poems being shared at the moment. Yeah, as Natalie says, you cannot go wrong with a bit of Michael Rosen. He is an absolute great starter. If you can't find anything, please do go to him. Benjamin Zephaniah, Joseph Coelho, brilliant. Thanks, Leah. We really love Joseph Coelho. Joshua Segal, I saw flipping up there. Some Lewis Carroll, some Edward Lear. We got some classic poetry again coming through here. So we've had Joseph Coelho, we've got Benjamin Zephaniah, Edward Lear, Spike Milligan. So we've got a range through the ages as well. Okay. All right. Now I want you to do something a little bit more specific. Okay. This has started us off in that conversation. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper than this. I want you to take a moment, and you don't have to share this one. You can just do this on a piece of paper in front of you. I want you to list all of the poems, the poets, the poetry collections, or the anthologies that you can remember drawing on in the last full academic year prior to and during the pandemic. First of all, how much poetry is on that list? And then look down and see how varied are the kinds and styles of poetry that have been featured in your list. When you make that list, then, what perceptions of poets and poetry might the list you've made convey? And then think about how representative and inclusive is the list that you've got here, considering and drawing back to all of the things that Farah has said to you in the previous sessions as well. So take a minute just to do that for yourself. I'm just going to go quiet for a minute and let you pull that together. And then if you're happy to, I'd really like you to make some reflections in the chat. You don't have to put the full list up there, but any reflections that you can make on the list that you've made in front of you. Okay, so just have a minute of quiet thinking to get on with that. So already really quickly, people are beginning to make some of those observations. Claire's said we've included poetry alongside fiction, but the questions have got her thinking about being way off where they could or should be in looking at poetry as standalone units of study. Hannah's just gone, whoops, just realised our poems, songs in year 5 are all men. Everything else is a few classic songs, pop songs by female artists, but everything else is all very male. Leah's just said, weirdly, we also use a lot of male poetry. Oh, Nicola Balmer's talking about Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming. Absolutely beautiful book there. Yeah, lovely one to draw on, Nicola. And again, it's a verse novel written in poetic prose. But again, linking back to what Farah said about building that spine, it's a really good account of racism in Black America, which can help pupils build a wider perspective of the civil rights experience. Lisa saying, use many examples of haiku. Yeah, you might think about, do you have that variety of poetic forms or poetic devices? How much do children know specifically about forms and devices? Anyone else apart from the Jacqueline Woodson comment? And what's how representative, how inclusive is your list in terms of poets from backgrounds other than being white? Yep, Nicola, very brave to say. Apart from that, all the other poets are men. How inclusive is the representation of the men if we break that down as well? Francis is talking about using Shirley Hughes. Did you use Out and About, Francis? Her Out and About collection is amazing for years 1 and 2. Really good focus on real outdoor experiences for young children that really do engage them in the outdoors. Yes, thank you. Thought you did, Francis. Yeah, really brilliant for now as well in a post-COVID world where we want to get children re-engaging with the outdoors, with nature, with socialising, with looking after the planet again. So hopefully that was a really useful example for you. Why I pulled this up is that this was a really eye-opening thing for the teachers on the research project to be able to do. I'm going to share with you now a quote that we pulled from one of the teachers' final case studies about why this is so important. She connected with poetry herself when we had one of the course tutors, Sarah Crossan. I don't know how many people know Sarah Crossan. If you like a verse novel, Sarah Crossan is the absolute queen of verse novels. I would say more for you as a teacher reader at this stage because she's a very young adult writer. If you're in year 6, you might want to look at something like The Weight of Water, which is a good introduction at a very end of year 6 level. But Lucy, the teacher who shared this quote with us, Sarah was the first poet that connected with her because it was a youngish woman like her who was talking in the same way that she would talk, who was speaking passionately about the things that she was passionate about. And Lucy said, the importance of understanding how a breadth of poetry was so important came to her after that Sarah Crossan session because it truly opened her eyes to poetry, and she saw that it could offer her something personally, not just as a teacher of poetry. So many times we come to a text with, okay, what's the learning in this? What are we going to get out of this? What's the writing outcome? Without looking at what is the text doing for us, both as a reader and as a person. And she said that Sarah was the person she could relate to the most so far, and her passion about poetry was quite inspiring for her. But what this triggered in Lucy was that realization of how important it is to see yourself as someone who can be excited about poetry by seeing other people like yourself getting involved. This made a real lasting effect on her, and she then thought about the profiles of her children in her classroom, and she went back to her year 4 class and chose Benjamin Zephaniah to see if he would be the kind of person that her children would connect with. They were all really engaged with it, partly because a lot of the poems she was sharing were humorous, and at that year 3, year 4 level, humorous poetry is really important for engaging children. However, what stood out to her most was when she shared a video of Valerie Bloom performing the poem Haircut Rap with the children. And Ashley, one of her young girls, commented, "I didn't know poets could be black people too. I thought Valerie Bloom was white." Now, if you've read any of Valerie's poetry, that would be an incredible amount of appropriation if a white person chose to write in that way. But what we need to unpick is that thinking. What are children seeing as who a poet is? Who are they seeing poetry as a place for? And if they don't see people that they can connect with in the way that Lucy connected with Sarah in their world of poetry, they're going to be excluded from that place, and they're not going to see that poetry is a space and a place for them. So as Lucy says here in this quote, we've got to think about how important it is not only to choose poets who represent the children so they have those positive poetry role models, but also share those video clips of the poets themselves. Don't just say Valerie Bloom because it doesn't mean anything to them. Show them a video of Valerie performing. Let them hear her dialect and think about that importance that children can be allowed and expected to be interested in poetry, and not that it's something for other people, or in the worst case scenario, just for old white men. We need to think about the range and breadth of poetry that we can share with pupils. I could do a little pub quiz at this time. Does anyone? Let's have a little pub quiz in the chat, because that's always good on a weekday afternoon. Think about the people that you can see on here. How many of these people do you recognise? Drop some names in the chat if you recognise any of the people that are in front of you here. Right, bonus point, ding, 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 Michael Rosen. Let's get that one out of the way. Okay, that was the easy way in. Who else do we recognise here? No, Nicola, it's not embarrassing at all. I've set this to be deliberately difficult. I'm tripping you up here. These are new, these are contemporary. Some of them are more long-standing poets that you see here. If I said some of their names, you would probably be able to recognise them. Have a good look along the rows, have a good think. Think to yourself now, are there any that you think that the children might know, or that are there any that looking at them you think, oh, that might be the sort of person that might engage some of my pupils? Alice has very tentatively said John Agard. Yes, John Agard is up there. He's bottom row. I'll give second from the right. John Agard with the white beard down there. We've definitely got John Agard there. Anyone else? Claire said she follows one of them on Twitter, but forgotten their name. Do you know which one, Claire, that you follow on Twitter? Can you do a brief description and we can maybe narrow them down? Carl Nova, yes, Emily, top left there. They know Carl as they booked the pop-up festival. Oh, that's brilliant. We've worked with Carl on his pop-up festival session, so that's brilliant. Claire's saying the blonde poet without glasses, that's Sue Hardy-Dawson. So Sue's one of our shortlisted poets for our Clipper Award. The year actually that Carl Nova won it in 2018 with her collection Where Zebras Go. Okay, I'm going to go top left down, following the rows from left to right. So top left there, you've got Carl Nova. Next to him, you've got Kate Wakeling. Then we all knew Michael Rosen. You've then got Grace Nichols. And next to Grace Nichols, you've got John Lyons. Middle row there, you've got Matt Goodfellow, fantastic poet from Manchester. Next to Matt, you've got Ruth Awolola. Ruth is one of the poets we've been working on in our Royal Africa Society Poetry in the Primary Classroom projects, along with Carl as well. In the middle of the middle row, you've got Philip Gross there. He's been shortlisted for the Clipper many a time. Sue Hardy-Dawson, who Claire follows on Twitter. And next to Sue Hardy-Dawson, you've got James Berry, fantastic poet. If you don't know James Berry, please do look him up. Bottom row then, starting from the left, we've got Victoria Aduke-Bully. She produced poems with Ruth Awolola for the Rising Stars collection that was highly commended for our Clipper Award in 2019. I'm sure when I say the name, you'll know the person next to Victoria. That's Valerie Bloom. Then next to Valerie Bloom, you have Kwame Alexander, another brilliant writer of verse novels. I can't remember who said, it was it you, Nicola, who read Jacqueline Woodson. If your kids like verse novels, get into Kwame Alexander's verse novels as well, particularly the crossover and booked are brilliant for year 5 and year 6. Then you've got John Agard and Laura Mooker. Yes, Nicola, I'm happy to put those names together on a slide for you. Don't worry. But have a look at this now. What does this say to you? If you had these poets, if you had these representations of poetry in your primary school, what is this now telling children about poetry? What is this telling them that poetry is for? What is this telling them about who can be involved with and who can engage with poetry? Absolutely. As Emily says, poetry is for everyone, and that's the message we need to get across to children. Please do go to the Poetry Line pages. Farah, perhaps could you put a link to Poetry Line in the chat for me while we're going along? And there you can see all of these poets and more with video performances and video interviews on our websites that we have absolutely free to access as the National Poetry Centre for Primary Schools, so that you can bring a breadth and a range of poets to life in the classroom for your children. In the next part of the session, we're then going to move on to looking at what we know about the importance of poetry for young pupils. We need to know what poetry offers us as a medium for reading and writing before we can engage in it fully. And we need to be able to see what poetry offers us in terms of shaping our identity, shaping our empathy, helping us to make sense of experiences, and to learn about the craft of writing. And that, I think, is more important in a post-COVID landscape now more than ever. Going back to that Ofsted review of English that we talked about earlier, one of the things that they pulled out here was that poems were mined for that use of language. And I worry with the national curriculum emphasis on grammar, we're going back to do this again. Poems being mined for use of adjectives, metaphors, contrasting sentences, without first attempting to engage pupils' personal responses to the ideas and the feelings that a poem expresses. That makes the text, as they say here, become a kind of manual for writing rather than that opportunity for personal response to experience. And we see that with a lot of writing that's going on in primary now. It's almost like that cut and shut writing that ticks all of the assessment focuses, but what you want to look for is what lies at the heart of that writing. Why is the writer writing? What are they writing for? What is their aim? What's their purpose, their audience? What form are they writing in? And how are they choosing and using language to engage their readers in the most appropriate ways? This has to come from the experience of reading as well, particularly with poetry. When we're reading poetry with children, we've got to emphasize that aesthetic experience first. We want to encourage readers to enjoy that experience of simply reading a poem, to relish uncertainties of meaning and the nature of the knowledge that the poems evoke within us. And that's a comment from our project evaluation by Andrew Lambeth. When you do that with the children, you find that it makes an incredible impact on their response. As one of our course participants said here, you get that very natural response to poetry as they learn to do that with you. You open up conversations so that everyone feels they have something to say, and there's not a right or wrong answer, because there never is with poetry. It's subjective. When children respond to poems, they're going to talk about things that they find clever or that connect with them particularly. Some of them might go in to take that analytical approach because they do think about what language they hear, whether it's onomatopoeia, whether it's assonance or alliteration. But what we need to think about is how we help children to show that ambiguity with poetry, knowing that there's a range of possible interpretations and learning to build on the ideas of others when discussing a poem. I think that one of the worst perceptions is that a poem is a puzzle to be solved. It's really not. It's a place where a reader can bring their own experience to interpreting that, and there's a myriad of different possibilities depending on the person stepping into that reading. So we're going to do a little bit of this together now. We're going to read a poem together. I'll read the poem out loud to you, and I want you to just go in with that emotional response at the beginning. Very immediately, I want you to just share, either by unmuting or dropping it in the chat. What does this poem make you think about? How does the poem make you feel? When you've got hold of those thoughts and those feelings, then go back and look at the text on the page. Think about what is it that's making you feel that way? What is the poet doing? And then think about if you've got any personal connections that you make with the poem. It might remind you of something you've done in your own life. It might remind you of a personal experience from your own life. It might remind you of something else you've seen in a book or a film or on TV. And think about what questions it provokes for you as well. So we're going to read the poem first, and then I just want you to go in with that very immediate response of what it makes you think about and how it makes you feel. Then start unpicking that deeper meaning of what it is that makes you feel that way and what personal connections you have and what questions it provokes for you. This is Welcome. This is by Valerie Bloom, and it's illustrated by Ken Wilson Max, and it's from Valerie's new collection with Otter Barry Books. Welcome. And on the 8th day, they knew for certain that she had come to stay. So they touched her lips and stroked sugar on her palm, with ginger for health and oil for calm. water for cleansing and washing out strife, salt for happiness, cola nut for long life. And so she tasted the world. Then the sound of her name gave speech to the drums, made poets of her kinsmen. Now, they said, like the rooster whose feet have passed through the fire, you will stay with us. The feasting and dancing would last all night, but she would dream of whispers from the sea. And when a wrinkled face unwrapped empty gums above her, staring into her, startling her whimpers, her mother's voice was the sea, breaking in gentle waves over her. Bia, bia, me baby, baby want to sleepy, 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 baby want to sleep. And the sea whispered, welcome, Chinello, welcome. Okay, either unmute or drop into the chat. What did that poem make you think about? How did it make you feel?
Made me think of like rituals, new life, welcome.
Yep. How did it make you feel, Claire, when you heard it?
A little bit emotional in some ways, actually.
Was there something in particular that stirred that emotion within you?
Well, I think that there was a line right near the beginning, well, even the first one, on the 8th day they knew for certain. It just made me think, had there been some challenge before that, or was that a poignant day within this cultural experience?
Lovely. Thank you, Claire, for starting us off. Leah in the chat has said it's a very calming poem. There's lots of love in it. Is there anywhere particularly you feel the love in that poem, Leah? The detailed descriptions, really bring you into that experience. It's very visceral. It makes you feel like you're there. And as Hannah said, she details that by saying it draws on your senses. It's the whispering, the sounds of things. It feels like a hug. Nicola saying again, it's very calm. It's like being transported to a different place with the whispers of the sea in the background. Yeah, absolutely. Any other connections you have with the poem? Anything raises questions in your mind? Anything else you feel particularly poignant about the poem? Did it make anyone feel a different way? Any personal connections that you have with the poem? Does it remind you of any of the events in your own life or anything else you've seen or read anywhere else? It's lovely having that. So I have to apologise for my singing because I am tone deaf, but it's lovely having that song verse in the middle of it as well. As Nicola said, that contrast of the rhythm of the lullaby with the other sections, and it makes it really calming. Natalie's talking about, being able to connect with how she welcomed her own daughter into the world. And Nicola saying, again, it's a christening style celebration. So even if we haven't got experience of that exact experience that's being described there, we can all connect with something in our own lives that brings us into the poem, that makes us feel part of it, that allows us to connect with it, to empathize, to make sense of things that happen in the world and in our own lives. And that's what's really important in engaging children with poetry from the beginning. If we think about what's really important in taking poetry forward into the curriculum, we need to look at and we need to think about the fact that poetry is a really important branch of literature in its own right. As somebody said before, yes, it's great to do a poem that enables you to get deeper into a fiction text or a non-fiction text, but are we looking at poetry as a genre within itself? And do we have opportunities for the reading and writing of poetry to be regularly built into the whole curriculum? It's also important to provide time and opportunity opportunity to hear poetry read aloud. The brilliant thing about poetry is that you can drop it into any part of the school day. You can think about, come back in after lunch. If you want to dissipate all of those arguments that have happened, the fights that have happened, that, oh, I'm too hot, I'm too hot, just start by reading a poem and they'll just come in around you and they'll sit down. You don't have to have the conversations around it. Drop it in, just let it flow. But again, if children want to talk about the poems, then you can open up those wider discussions. It is important to give the time and opportunity for them to enjoy reading poetry for pleasure without that need for a concrete response too. And children engage really well, and it really helps to develop reading fluency when you give opportunities for children to practice and perform poetry. It does add to that reading fluency, but also the comprehension, that understanding and enjoyment of poetry alongside. If you haven't seen it before, do also take a look at the National Poetry Day National Literacy Trust research on poetry, a thing that makes me happy. That research in the headlines showed that nearly half of children are enjoying and engaging with poetry in their free time. That means that they either consume it, they read it, they listen to it, or they watch it, they create it, they might write it or perform it, or they might do both. The really interesting statistic that came out of it was that children in free school meals are much more likely to engage with poetry in their free time than their better off peers. And as they grow older, they're also the children who are much more likely to enter poetry competition and slams. So really important in thinking about how we draw all of our children back into learning, particularly after gaps in learning in lockdown. So throughout the rest of the session, we're going to introduce you to a range of important poetry experiences that are going to exemplify how you develop and how you enrich poetry practice across your school. Now, that has to start at the very centre with a learning community that appreciates the value of poetry across the curriculum. Each of the experiences you see highlighted on that diagram there should be an embedded part of the practice and the provision in every year group, starting off with that really key act of listening to poetry, letting language wash over you, having experience of a range and breadth of voices and styles. Giving time, like we just did with that welcome poem, to that reading and the initial responses, connecting with poems on an emotional level. Allowing children to get deeper under the surface of a poem by preparing poems for performance, because in performing poetry, they've really got to think deeply about the meaning and the emotion imbued in a poem and how they're going to communicate that to the audience that's listening. We also need to allow space for those deeper responses, coming back to poems over and over again, looking at what did we not see the first time? How does that link with what we know now? How can opinions of others shape our own understanding of what a poem could mean? We also need to think about that understanding of the different poetic forms and devices. Someone mentioned haiku earlier. What other kinds of poems do your children know? There's always a danger that lower down, children always think poems have to rhyme. They don't. Actually, it's free verse that's the most prevalent medium that poets and children as poets write in as they move through primary school. And then think about how we provide those opportunities and those invitations for children to write poetry for themselves. Now, the face-to-face training sessions that we have are always highly interactive, and we encourage people to engage in activities, and we're going to do that throughout the rest of the session with you here. Finishing off, I'm just warning you again with that writing workshop where we're going to get you to write some poetry. So we will have some more practical activities as we move through. What we're going to think about is that writing scale now and that reading scale that Farah talked about before, and how poetry sits within that, and what poetry can do for readers and writers at specific stages of the reading and writing scale. When we start from the very beginning with those very early readers in reception and early key stage 1, developing that solid foundation of song, rhythm and rhyme is really important, both for children's language awareness, their speaking and listening development, but also their knowledge of phonics as well. They can put a lot of phonics knowledge into context and into practice when they're looking at rhyming patterns within words and when they're looking at things like alliteration and assonance. It's also important that poetry allows children to be able to chime in with the reading, because if we're moving from that focus on dependence from an adult into independence to being a reader yourself, being able to chime in is a really important step on that way. And the rhythm and the repetition in poetry really allows children that opportunity to engage in that chiming in. The parity text on the page also means that we can really look at how poetry can help develop children's knowledge that print carries meaning, and to follow along and learn one-to-one correspondence on a page. And in terms of their writerly knowledge, it's really important that they know that writing from the very beginning is a form of communication, and it can help us to express our ideas, to describe experiences, and to entertain an audience. As they move through into later Key Stage 1 and early Key Stage 2, as their literacy develops and they become more fluent, that continued importance of rhyme is still important to support children's knowledge of phonics and spelling, and also to develop that reading fluency. Poetry is also brilliant for developing comprehension beyond the literal. As you've seen from the 2 sessions we've done with you here, my passions are picture books and poetry, and they're for the exact same reason. It's because the space on the page and the space between the verses of poems and the space between the lines in poems makes children do that bit more reading work. There's so much more scope for inference, for deduction in the white space that's on the page, that allows children to be much more in depth in their responses and to develop their comprehension more widely. As we work through, we're also looking at those writerly behaviours that we want to develop too, knowing how to use language effectively to engage a reader, and knowing that writing, again, can be used to entertain, to capture moments, and also to reflect on or express their emotions. As children reach the end of primary, it's really easy to put poetry aside, but poetry is brilliant in supporting children to reach those greater depths of reading and writing. We want that continued engagement with reading poetry, allowing them to explore a variety of forms. We want to continue to be using poetry to develop knowledge of spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Every choice that a poet makes, a little bit like a picture book writer, is a judicious choice. They're using language for ultimate impact on their reader. So they're a really good vehicle for exploring why certain language, certain figurative language has been used. What we want to think about is how we use poetry to develop children's knowledge of language, vocabulary, and concepts outside of their own direct experience, and to continue developing those higher order reading skills of inference, deduction, and empathy through those personal connections with text. And in Key Stage 2, we really want to be able to develop that craft of writing and really knowing how to use that language for effect on a reader for a particular purpose. That emotional connection lies at the heart of that, and poetry and identity is incredibly important to explore so that children gain an effective response from reading, but are also able to apply really judicious authorial choices when they want to write about something that is of particular meaning to them. What we found in the Power of Poetry project was that poetry was an incredibly important vehicle to explore individual identity, but also the identity of others. And again, going back to that personal reflection, the personal response were the most important starting points. And that then goes on to enhance some of that more traditional analysis that scared some of the teachers off of doing poetry when we started. Poetry provides that brilliant means for children to find out and develop their own voice, and working alongside professional poets provides you with really important understanding of that inspiration and the process of writing poetry. And as Michael Rosen reflects here, poetry gives you that really invaluable opportunity for exploring thinking at a much deeper level. You can have opportunities for rich discussions around poems shared, and that should be a planned part of the provision from the early years onwards. Right from the beginning, you can use collections like Michael Rosen's fantastic A Great Big Cuddle to share with children that they can explore their own emotions and their own experiences through poetry. This one's brilliant, I Am Angry. Look at the way the illustration, the text works on the page to really communicate that feeling of anger. Look at the ways the short sentences and the short phrases build up to give you that really punchy sense of anger. And look at the emotional journey that you're taken on in this poem as I read it to you. I am angry, really angry, 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 angry. I'm so angry, I'll jump up and down, I'll roll on the ground, make a din, make you spin, pull out my hair, throw you in the air, pull down posts, hunt down ghosts, scare spiders, scare tigers, pull up trees, bully beads, rattle the radiators, frighten alligators, cut down flowers, bring down towers, bang all the bones, wake up stones, shake the tiles, stop all smiles, silence birds, boil words, mush up names, grind up games, crush tunes, squash moons, make giants run, terrify the sun, turn the sky red, and then go to bed. You could really see children being able to connect with that, to be able to say, I can remember a time I've been angry. This is what I wanted to do when I was angry, and to start to craft their own lists of things that they can put together to make their own poem about being angry. It also helps children with that sense of self-regulation, recognizing, exploring, and learning how to deal with emotions. We could contrast a poem like this with this next poem, Lost. Look at the difference in the way that the text is presented. Look at the way each poem uses the illustration and the text to really communicate the feeling that's being felt. But then listen to the difference between that short, punchy, angry poem that we had and this poem here, Lost. One moment they were there, and we were having fun. Now they've disappeared, every single one. I don't know where to go, and I'm feeling rather scared. I don't know where they are. It's not as if they cared. I'm lost. I'm lost. I'm halfway up the stairs. They've only gone and left me, and nobody cares. Help me, someone. Can't you hear me shout? Isn't anybody here who can come and help me out? I'm alone, and I'm lonely. And it's starting to get dark. Where is everyone? Did they go to the park? Are they in? Are they out? Did they go up to town? Do you think I should go upstairs or down? I don't know. I don't know anything at all. I'm going to sit still now and just look at the wall. So again, really different emotion experience there, communicated in a different way, throwing in those rhetorical questions to add the confusion of the situation in there. Look at the size of the text on the page. Look at the way it's all squished into the middle of the poem. What's it telling you? What's it adding to our understanding of what that feeling is? And then how do we embrace and allow the children to embrace that emotion and that feeling for themselves? Performing is an absolutely brilliant way to do this. Allowing children the opportunity to engage in working in role helps them to step inside moments more deeply. You might give them simple props that allow them to become characters that represent the I in the poem. And when they perform, they're going to have to read and reread and prepare those poems for performance. That allows them to build confidence and fluency in their reading, as well as connecting much more deeply with the meaning behind the poem. You'll see this in the example that I'm going to share now with you from one of our CLPE shadowing award-winning schools. Just see what you think about this performance as you see it performed. Just note down in the chat what's really striking to you about the way this child is engaging with the poem.
One moment they were there and we were having fun. Now they've disappeared, every single one. I don't know where to go and I'm feeling rather scared. I don't know where they are, it's not as if they cared. I'm lost, I'm halfway upstairs. They've only gone and left me and nobody cares. Help me, sorry, but can't you hear me shout? Isn't anybody here who can come and help me out? I'm alone and lonely, it's starting to get dark. Where is everyone? Did they go to the park? Are they in or out? Did they go uptown? Do you think I should go upstairs or down? I don't know. I don't know anything at all. I'm just going to sit still now and just look at the wall.
Really poignant performance there. Again, Nicholas said in the chat as well, poetry is a great vehicle for those younger, reluctant readers in Key Stage 1 struggling with stamina, lacking in expressive language. Yeah, absolutely. It shows them that they can achieve. Yeah, absolutely. Nicholas just said, oh, just awe, so emotive, says Laura. Very powerful. She was fab. Yeah. You can see it's a great performance because you can see she's connected completely with the meaning of it. She's had time and space to talk about it, to connect with it, to maybe share her own experiences of what it feels to be lonely or lost. That's what's going to take children much more deeply into comprehending what poetry is and what it can do for them as readers. That has to also carry on up into, Key Stage 2, because when we look at the National Literacy Trust reading survey data from 2019, you can see some really interesting explorations about the percentage of children who are reading daily outside of class. If you look at the graph on screen now, you see a really marked decline in reading that begins when children reach the age of 9. Now, we can all put our own perceptions into that about what happens at age 9 and then what continues to happen until children get to age 16, and then look at how it starts to rise again after 16. What impact does SATs, what impact do GCSEs have on children's enjoyment and engagement of reading? That's a really important question to be asking ourselves. And that data also matches data collected in the Scholastic Kids and Family Reading Report that also noticed this marked decline at 9, as they call it. It's interesting then to look at the kinds of text that older pupils are reading. Lots of you talked in the chat at the beginning about using song lyrics as part of poetry as well. And this was really striking in this survey data as well. Look at the bottom bar there, look at the overwhelming popularity of song lyrics. And again, that those are mostly explored on screen within that age group. What we need to be thinking about that is, as our children get older, how do we monopolize on that knowledge to start to build their engagement in reading? I'm going to show you a poem now from a poet, Carl Nova. I know somebody recognized him from our array of poets on the screen, but I want you to think about what is it about his poetry that might be engaging for our pupils at upper primary, and what might make you think about using this type of poetry in the classroom as well. So here's Carl performing his poem, Poetry.
This is called Poetry with a question mark. When I was a kid, poetry seemed boring. Complex words on the page that almost left me snoring. I felt no connection, the language seemed foreign. If it fought for my attention, it was pointless boring. I was introduced to text, held in high esteem. I did recognize the genius, but it meant nothing to me. But all that changed when I heard an MC speak a poetic language that really went deep. It's like I woke up from being fast asleep. Everything seemed to slow down. I felt my soul leap. I was amazed how his words transformed him from being a skinny geek into someone enormous. He gained energy as he kept performing. Something was awakened in me so dormant. It deeply moved me to pick up a pen, to put down lines of my own, many gems I discovered hidden deep in my soul. I dug deeper, struck oil and found gold. Now I share all these riches that I've found, communicating feelings and thoughts through sound. Now that's poetry I'm glad that I've found, the kind that speaks to me right here and right now. Poetry.
Okay, have a think in the chat now. Have you used poetry like that in your classroom? What do you think might appeal to your older readers in Key Stage 2? Nicola's saying already it's super cool. It's like rap. Her older children would love it. Great way to inspire those too cool for school children to join in. Yeah, absolutely. Claire's saying great perform. Oh, sorry, that's from the first one. Sorry. Anyone else seen Carl before? Anyone think about the ways in which it might engage children? Yep, Claire saying again, Upper Key Stage 2 would love it. She agrees. Natalie saying no, hasn't heard of him before, but definitely going to from now on. Well, Cole has got many videos on our Poetry Line website, and Farah's put a link to Poetry Line in the chat already. There is also a teaching sequence for his collection, Rhythm and Poetry, if you like that. And if that's inspired you, it's about looking at the impact that this can have on children as well. I'm going to introduce you to the little boy you saw right at the beginning of my session when I talked about the Clipper shadowing scheme. This is Quincy, and Quincy was really switched on to language, to literacy, to performance through engaging with the poetry of Carl Nova. This is Quincy here, and I'm just going to show you his performance of Carl's poem, The Dancer. This is possibly one of the most remarkable shadowing performances that we have ever seen as judges of the shadowing scheme. And it showed us that perfect connection between the right child, the right poet, and the right poem. And this is what we would like our children to aspire to.
From a distance, all I could see was a crowd gathered round. I could also hear the music, and I really loved the sound. It was a sunny summer afternoon, and as I moved closer, the heat increased. I was sipping on a cola, and I pushed to the front of the crowd. And what I saw was so amazing that it left me in awe. A man in a tracksuit was spinning on the floor. He was spinning on his head. Then suddenly, he paused. He twisted his arms and legs to the rhythm. He was popping and locking to the beats of the sound system. The crowd roared at every move. He danced rapidly. He did things that made me think he could defy gravity. Backflips. Front flips. So acrobatic. And all in time with the beats. So fantastic. He's so flexible. His joints must be elastic. It's what I thought to myself as the music blasted.
And Carl for Quincy was like Sarah Crossan was for Lucy, that teacher that we started off with. And that's what we want for our children. What we're going to think about now is thinking about how we encourage those creative responses to poetry. Now, that might involve expressing our feelings, thinking about how it makes us feel, articulating our thoughts, what it makes us think about, discussing our ideas, having that engagement in authentic dialogue, discussing the language, how words work, using our imagination. Does it inspire our imagination? Does it trigger us to want to write? Or if we don't want to write, to think about how we could represent our thoughts, our feelings, our imagination through a creative activity. We need to think about then how we encourage children to express those thoughts, those feelings, those ideas in their writing. As our book, The Power of a Rich Reading Classroom, reflects on, when we get children to write poetry, they're encouraged to reflect on their experiences, to recreate them, to shape them, to make sense of them. And in a poem, it's really possible to give that form and significance to particular events in their lives or feelings and communicate them to the reader or the listener. Immersing children in the pleasures of poetry through listening to, reading, responding to, and performing really supports them to understand that poetry is a powerful form of creative expression, and it provides them with models and choices about how they write poetry for themselves. This is a poem called I Am from Carl's latest collection, The Curious Case of Carl Nova. And poems like this can really help children to express themselves in quite unique ways. This poem might not look a lot on the page, but this is a poem that was written by one of the children in one of the Power of Poetry schools. It was a hospital school in South London, and this was an 11-year-old girl who suffered deeply with psychosis. She'd been really ill, really difficult for her to respond, to engage in learning. They'd had lots of battles with her just being in a space to be able to listen and learn, and she also had some learning difficulties underneath all that. But this was a poem that really engaged her. She really identified with Black characters in stories, and that really coloured her choices. The teacher said here, I loved her choice of Black and the pride that she had in shouting out her work, the strength that she gave key words. He said it's hard to know what's going on inside her sometimes, but this poem really showed that her choices weren't random because of the way that she read. He said it was like a light went on inside of her when she actually engaged in this activity. It's also thinking about the experiences that we give to children in being able to share their identity through poetry as well. Do we allow children to write in their first language, like in this very powerful example from Kate Clancy's England Poems from a School? Do we allow and give children license to explore and express their feelings and experiences? This poem here, Gingerbread Man by Joseph Coelho, was one of our really well responded to poems when Joe won this Clipper in 2015. It really allowed children to kind of get on board with an emotional situation of a character and to really reflect on their personal responses to this poem, drawing on personal experiences they've had before. All the way through this poem, we think Billy is the bully, but listen to the final line and think about how your perceptions change. Billy chased me round the playground with hands full of fists. Billy yelled at me across the football pitch with a mouth full of stings. Billy spat, jibed and cawed as I ran away singing, "You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." Billy had red hair. I was cruel and called him names. Now have a think about that. What feeling does that poem leave you with? How is that different to when you read I am angry or lost? In our work with schools and children, we see really loads of examples of children gaining that sense of voice and choice in their writing through writing poetry of their own. And through writing poetry, they're encouraged to reflect on their experience, to recreate it, to shape it, to make sense of it. In a poem, it's really possible to give form and significance to particular events or feelings in the way that Joe did with that poem just there, and to communicate that to the reader or to the listener. And in this example, Mahir, who's a 10-year-old from London, he wrote a very unique response after hearing that poem, Gingerbread Man, and those feelings of shame and guilt resonating in him. This is his poem, Racism. They called me black, but I said, don't, we have the same blood. They called me a terrorist, but I worship Allah and I will prove you wrong. I was full of red and I hit them. I was angry and I left a mark. I was ashamed. That's the real power of poetry, to give children that voice and that impetus to write in that way. The last poem I'm going to share now is a poem called The Day by Matt Goodfellow from his collection Bright Bursts of Colour. I'm going to play Matt reading this poem to you, and you can follow on with the text in the screen. But I want you to think about, as you hear it, how do you feel about the I in the poem? What makes you feel that way? And how do your feelings change throughout the poem? Here's The Day.
The Day. We cycle over beech nuts. He points out our breath, columns of sunlight shining through the changing trees and the damp, heavy river smell. I'm worried about today's spelling and times tables tests. I struggle with which and which. We practice my 6s and 8s as we pedal past cloudy-faced kids and parents. He helps me across the busy road, laughs at the grumpy caretaker who sighs and swings his keys as he lets the morning masses pass through the gates. I put my bike in the bike shed. He kisses me, tells me not to worry about stuff. I love you. Have a good day. See you later, kidder. I'll be here at 3:30. Good luck. I wave through the window as overhead a plane is coming into land. He pushes his bike through playground puddles and turns to blow me one last kiss, puts on his helmet and adjusts the strap. And it's 5 years later, and he never came back.
So you've got that same impact. It's those last two lines just in Gingerbread, just as we saw in Gingerbread Man, that really pack a punch in that poem. Anything that you want to think about, please do note in the chat as well. Matt's got that ability to really write poems that help children to make sense of particular feelings or particular experiences that they've had. This was an experience he shared on Facebook about doing a workshop in a school where he was getting them to write poems about the truths in their lives. And one of the kids said to him, I don't know what to write. And he said, have you thought of a person you'd like to write about? He said, yeah, my dad's, I've got 2. And he said, oh, cool. Maybe you can write a poem about each of them. And the little boy said, can I write about my first dad who died? And Matt gave him that license by saying, yes, mate, yes, you can. And that was something that a lot of the kids, when we explored Power of Poetry, wanted to do as well. This was a fantastic poem that was written by a little boy called Felix, who'd lost his granddad, and his family were really worried that he hadn't opened up or talked talked about the experience at all. He was just carrying on with things as it was, and they were worried that at one point it would come to a head and it would really affect him, but it was through poetry that he was able to make sense of the experience, and his teacher Anna went back and shared this with his parents, which opened up the gateway for them to be able to talk about it further. This is My Granddad by Felix. I wake up, I'm up and out of my bed, my granddad. I'm downstairs, I tuck into my egg, my granddad. Then a flash, the news came. My granddad was dead. My granddad. The world froze, everything started to buzz. I couldn't hold it. My granddad. So in just bringing this session to a close before we move into our writing workshop, ensure all of your staff are aware of a wide range of poets and styles of poetry, such as the ones we've shared in that session there. Make sure you're all choosing collections that inspire your pupils and show them what poetry is and what it could be. Make sure you're reading poetry aloud. Make sure kids can see it performed and give them opportunities to perform themselves. Allow that time and space for them to respond authentically to what they've read. Draw on that expertise of practicing poets. Be engaged as a reader and a writer of poetry yourself, and support them in writing poetry from themselves. As we move into the break now, I want you to think about what topics, what interests, what experiences in your own life might provide you with stimulus for your own writing. What do you think your children might want to write about if they're given the freedom of choice? What do you think the successes of such an approach might be, and where might the challenges lie? We're going to go for our next 10-minute comfort break now, coming back at 3:30, and then we're going to spend the last half an hour in a writing workshop together, where we're going to get you to write a poem together. So go stretch your legs, come back in 10 minutes, and we'll finish the session today by writing some poetry together. Thanks, everyone. Brilliant. I'm going to hand back over to Farah, and we're going to start our writing workshop, where we're going to get you to now explore an aspect of your own identity through writing.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for being so prompt on return. This last segment is literally about us putting everything that we've been talking about and reflecting on into practice, and thinking about how that translates in terms of outcome for ourselves as writers, and then by extension how that translates for our children as writers. And driving all of this is the value of, as is expressed in the foreword of this title, which is a great title if you've not come across it, and we'd absolutely advocate you having a read. Foreword really thinking about the importance of centering children's personal stories, personal narratives, really giving them, using writing to give them that voice, to giving them a sense of the validity of that voice, and encouraging them to draw on those life experiences as a means and a set of tools to putting pen to paper. And so with that in mind, thinking about the kinds of stimuli that we might present to children to tap into those life experiences, to tap into those connections to help them in formulating their own voice as writers. And a couple of you touched on Look Up as a really great example early on in the session, but coming back to this spread, this is a classic kind of illustration or exemplification of that hair brushing scene has a universality about it. And it's universality in terms of our ability to connect with it in different ways, because we've all had that encounter in some capacity growing up, and so we can immediately recognize the frustrations, the comfort, the varying emotions that will come with having your hair brushed and yanked by the adult in your life. But the nuance here allows not just for that universality, but also the opportunity to speak directly to the Black reader, in that it allows the reader to recognize that experience specifically just through the delicate use of cues and props that feature as part of the illustration there. And hair is a really personal thing, and there's been explorations of our relationship with hair as a prevalent part of the discourse within Black communities for some time. And this has formed the basis of expression and reflection through various art forms. So you will have encountered documentaries, more books increasingly, particularly targeted at the children's market, film that really kind of tackles some of the issues issues around this. And again, that will really resonate with a lot of our young learners. And so we thought we'd take hair as a starting point to kind of inspire the direction that we're going to take with the writing workshop, because it's something that can often be challenging to capture from a reflecting realities perspective. When we're looking at the titles that are submitted, often kind of the fleshing out of character is compromised by just kind of keeping it very surface. So oftentimes we'll encounter a book that the only signifier of the person being a character of colour is the fact that they've got curly hair, and it doesn't go beneath the surface of that. And so this gives us a forum to really think about, how do you flesh out authentic portrayals? How do you create meaningful characterizations? And that's what we're going to tap into by using hair as a stimulus for that in this last part of the session.
So we're going to begin to take you through an authentic model for writing that we've developed as part of both the Power of Pictures and the Power of Poetry training. We're going to take you through, first of all, the ideation stages, sharing some stimulus with you that helps you build up your own ideas. And then we're going to start to take you through the creation process. We're then going to give you the stimulus to go on and reflect on and publish your work for a wider audience post-session, so that you've got something to continue on with. And following an authentic model for writing like this allows students to feel what it's like to be a writer for themselves. It's so much more than simply just doing writing tasks. And if you follow a model like this, you're going to result in much more well-developed pieces of writing. The pupils will follow a truly creative process and have the impetus to write for themselves. So I'm going to read aloud now a few extracts from picture books and poems about hair. And as I read them aloud, I just want you to start splurging some of your ideas or noting down some really effective words, phrases, language, whether they relate to your own hair type or not, that makes you think about hair more generally and how you might talk about hair yourself. So have a pen and paper in front of you and just start to note down words, phrases, concepts that you might want to explore in your own writing. I love my hair. It's soft and bouncy and grows up toward the sun like a flower. I love it up or down, styled or wild. I don't care. I just want it to be free. Okay, this is the next example now. I love my afro when it's out, so big and great and free. My daddy says it is my crown. It defies gravity. A creation to which none could compare. I am so glad it's mine. I love my hair. Okay, got a different experience in the next one. Jazz music, loud voices and laughter blend with the buzz of clippers and the soft swish, swish whisper of scissors skimming loose hairs from a freshly cut head. I look at the men in the row of chairs in front of me. I can see their faces in the long mirror that runs along an entire wall of the shop. The man in Mr. Seymour's chair is getting his head shaved. Take it all off, he says. A patch of sunlight gleams right on top of his bald head. There's a different book, similar kind of experience now. There's a dude to the left of you with a faux hawk, deep part skin fade. He looks presidential. Maybe he's the CEO of a tech company that manufactures cool. He's a boss. That's how important he looks. Dude to the right of you looks majestic. There are thousands of black angels waiting to guide and protect him as soon as he steps a foot out that door. That's how important he looks. Okay, here's the next poem now. First haircut. Noises near my ears bring shivers, a brush of sleeve, the snip of scissors. My neck feels long and bare. Something is just behind me, tiger's whiskers, monkey fingers, or a dragon claw combing, testing my courage. My legs dangle from a red high chair, tufts of hair sparkle as they fall, and the barber's feet shuffle through red and gold. It's chilly where hair no longer grows. My cape is back to front. I shut my eyes and feel an eagle's wing brush both shoulders. Then the cloak is whipped away and an older me, stranger, meets my gaze. This is when Mummy combs my hair. She tugs and pulls and twists and yanks. My hair sticks to the comb in hanks. She yanks and tugs and pulls and twists. My hair falls to the floor in bits. She twists and yanks and tugs and pulls. Hair's on the floor in large handfuls. She pulls and twists and yanks and tugs. Looks at my bald head, calmly shrugs. She thinks that I won't mind at all because I'm just a little doll. This is hairpiece. A while back, I wanted hair that was curly so badly that I got a thing called a perm, which stands for permanent wave. But the lady I paid to print my hair into a perm put too much of the curly chemical on, and after not long, my hair felt like a scorched hayfield and started to snap off. So for a while, I called myself Tufty, until other people started to call me Tufty too. And I told all this to my friend, sadly not called Shirley, who had hair that was curly, but wished fate had dealt her hair that was straight. So she ironed it flat with tongs, which also burnt it to a crisp and made it snap off. And amid these wrongs, we could both see there was something worth learning. But it was difficult to concentrate on this something, what with the smell of all that burning. So that last poem there was by Kate Wakeling, and we're going to pick up on Kate Wakeling in a moment. This one now is Ode to My Hair. If my hair were a tree, I'd climb it. I'd kneel down beneath and enshrine it. I'd treat it like gold and then mine it. Each day before school, I unwind it. And right before games, I entwine it. These locks on my hair, I designed it. Oh, and one last thing, if you don't mind it, that bet you just made, I decline it. Okay, we're going to pick up on Kate Wakeling now, and we're going to listen to her talking about the practices of writing. Really important to learn from the authentic practices that writers go through when they write. And I want you to think about the steps Kate goes through as she moves through that writing process.
When I set about writing a poem, I sort of do it in two chunks, really, often at quite different times. So often I might have an idea, but often I go to my notebook and I just write in a complete splurge. So really, really free, as sort of strange, or like try even not to kind of let the pen leave the paper. Just write very, very freely and see what comes out, and let the words sort of the shapes and the sounds of the words kind of guide where a line might go. And then I will come back to that and then become a completely different person, try and become very sort of organised and sort of unyielding. And then it's a very different process of lots and lots of checking and revising and sort of crafting it into more of a poem. But I think perhaps lots of poets use that sort of, have that twin approach. And I think it's nice that the first approach of a poem is something very, very free. And I think it's perhaps, I remember at school perhaps not feeling like that, feeling like you had to kind of begin thinking very formally about how the poem was going to be shaped. And actually, I've really enjoyed in the last few years, when I start writing, I feel as free and anarchic and kind of like there are no rules. I can just write absolutely how I might be feeling.
Okay, so we're going to pick up on that now and be free and anarchic ourselves. I'm going to give you 5 minutes of quiet writing time now. You're going to end up drafting a poem inspired by your hair, which is a key aspect of your identity. You might draw on some of the things we saw in the writing, how you feel about your own hair, the hair you wished you had but you don't have, a moment about your hair when you had it cut perhaps, where you've been to the hairdressers perhaps. For this first 5 minutes, I just want you to keep writing on your page anything to do with that topic of hair. It doesn't matter if it's nonsense, it doesn't matter if it's gibberish, it doesn't matter if you've got nothing to say and you just want to write down, I love my hair, or I hate my hair, or my hair is curly, or my hair is straight. Just try to keep writing. Repeat things if you want to. And then after that 5 minutes, we're going to think about honing our compositional skills and seeing what might be a germ of an idea to take into a poem. So I'm going to set you 5 minutes now. Just fill your page, splurge your page with ideas, anything you can think of inspired by hair. Don't stop writing for the whole 5 minutes. Off you go. Okay, that's your first 5 minutes up. Hopefully, I don't know if you can see mine, like me, you should have a page that is filled with just random thoughts, random words in random orders. This messy process, this draft process, is a really important part of the process. And many of the children, both on the Power of Poetry and the Power of Pictures projects, have been really uncomfortable with that idea of working messily first. They thought, as Kate said in that video, that their first draft should be a nicely ordered, perfectly composed thing, but that's just not how writing happens. So now I want you to spend a minute and I want you to look down at the writing that you've done on your page, and I want you to think of what are the key things that are standing out for you that could be the theme or could be the heart of the idea of your poem. If you've got that, can you drop it into the chat? Mine, and I'm going to drop it in here now, would be a poem about me wanting curly hair. I've always wanted, I'm looking at Ruth here now in front of me, I've always wanted hair like Ruth's. I've always wanted curly hair, but there is nothing I can do to get my hair curly. I can put rollers in it, I can tong it, I can do anything to it, and in 5 minutes it just drops straight again. That's the heart of my one. What's the heart of yours? Is it a particular experience? Is it a want, a need, a particular love of your hair? Nicola's talking about her lockdown hair. Yep, we might all, I definitely want to get rid of my lockdown split ends as well. Perhaps what is it about your lockdown hair? Yep, Leah again. I story of my life as well. I need a haircut. I don't know what I want to do with it. Yep. Claire, journey through hairbrush and cuts. Oh, from childhood to now with questions. What a lovely, basis for a poem there. Laura having her thick hair. Lisa, yep, absolutely, Lisa, embracing the grey hair. Francis, poem about the colour that coloured your hair into. Fantastic. Brilliant. So we've all got something different, and this is the beauty of writing in this way. Even if we start with the same topic, we can all take that topic in many different ways and craft it to shape our own identity of what we want to say from our own particular perspective. I'm just going to give you now a couple more minutes to think about honing your compositional skills now, just to round us up for today. I want you to think about what were you inspired in the texts and poems that I read out for you. Think about how they left space for the reader to come inside the moment with them. That particular moment, that particular experience that was being described. And I want you to think about starting to work up a draft. Now, I don't mean starting from the beginning and going right through to the end. You might start with the first couple of lines. They might not even be the first lines of the poem. They might end up being the middle lines of your poem, or even the lines that your poem ends with. So I'm going to get you now for the last 5 minutes just to think about, can you start to work up a kind of draft of some lines that you want? Go back to your page of messy draft work, think about what could you pull out, and now what can you start to hone and shape that into. So spend 5 minutes doing it. Do it in rough in your writing book that you've got in front of you, and then if you're brave enough, I'm going to ask you to share a particular line or a particular section that you're pleased with that you've composed with the wider group in the chat. So spend a few minutes now coming up with those first lines that could start off a draft of your poem. Okay, I'm going to leave you in quiet to do that. Thank you. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to be really brave and to work in this community of writers we've built up between us, and to see if there's a snippet or a fragment that you're able to share with us in the chat. Might be a line. Might be a couple of lines. Oh, thanks, Francis. It's my favourite colour, deep purple beetroot to be precise, with hints of spicy red and cool blue in the sunlight. Brilliant. Claire's got that really taking us into a moment. I immediately want in Claire's to find out who said this to her. It's a bird's nest, she said. Nicola's starting us off with that potential title, maybe, Lockdown Hair. And the brush catches and tugs. Brilliant. We've really got into that really visceral feeling. Oh, oh gosh, we've got a lovely lot here. Is it just me? Am I the only one? Surely not. I see grey. Others see silver. Oh, that's lovely, Lisa, that dual perception. Okay, Leah, you always know when you've got a good poet when they preface their entry with, I'm certainly not a poet, because I bet you are, Leah. What do I do with it? It's a question I've asked myself over and over and over and over. I grew it long for my wedding, but that's happened now, so I fancy a bit of a change. To fringe or not to fringe? Bob, lob, maybe nothing at all. No, not nothing at all. I need a change. Oh my goodness. Well done, Leah. Fantastic. Oh, Claire, I'm really building up a picture of your bit now. It's like you've been dragged through a hedge backwards, she said. Oh, Alice, you had a real similar line to me, actually. Want to curl it, twist it, twirl it. And the comb pulls and drags. Oh, Claire, I can really feel this battle that you've got with your hair now. Now, hopefully you can see that by breaking down that process into manageable chunks, it makes it a space where you can be tentative, where you can play with ideas, where you can think about the words that you want to choose and use and why. But to be inspired, we need to read lots of that poetry that gives us that inspiration to go up. Oh, Nicola's took the rest of hers in now. I'm going to have to read this before we go. Lockdown hair. Why should I care? No one to see. Get used to it. Crazy idea. Go darker than I thought. Cover the grey. Melt it away. But no. Brilliant. We're all suffering with our lockdown hair there. To move on from this, what you want to do is then look at how to work that up for an audience. So what you'd need to do is to work up that poem, get to something that you're finished as a first draft with, and then look at finding the rhythm of it. Read it out loud like I have just done there. Does it sound right? Get up, walk around the room, pace your poem out. Is the rhythm in there? As you do that, then think about the sense of what punctuation might be needed, where your line breaks might go, where words don't quite fit or sound right. Then work up a second draft. When you've got a second draft that you're comfortable with yourself, then think about who you could use as a response partner. Share that second draft with them. Talk to them about your sticking points, your challenges. Ask them for specific advice. What does it make them think about? How does it make them feel? Talk to them about any aspects you think you might need support with, and allow them to respond as a reader. Ask them what works for them and what they might suggest to improve it. And then if you're working as a response partner, either for a child or another adult that shared their writing with you, think carefully about how you're going to communicate your responses. Might you do it as a question rather than a comment? That allows the poet, the writer, to go back and reflect on their own work and think about it. Then you've got to think about getting back to that publication stage and how you might present your work to an audience. So when you've had that response from another, be prepared to work up another final draft and then share that with someone else. You might share it with your class if you're doing this as a teacher writer. If you're a bit more tentative, you might share it with another teacher in your school. Then think about how they responded to your final piece of writing and how it made you feel when they reacted to it. What did you feel at the end about your finished piece? What were the successes? What were the challenges? And that gives us that assessment for learning. We can then think about what we would do as a writer next time we come to write a poem for ourselves. But we can also consider as a teacher writer what it's made you consider when you're asking your children to write. Just to finish off today, as I round up the session, just drop in the chat. What are the things you're going to take away from today? What have you learned? What have you thought about poetry? What have you thought about writing and how writing comes from the work that we do leading up to writing? What have you learned about an authentic writing process that you might think about putting into practice back in school? I'll send Helen and Ruth a link to our Poetry in Primary Schools, What We Know Works booklet. This summarises lots of the activities that we've done today and talks about what's important in making a poetry friendly school. And we'll also send out examples of the texts and the poems that Farah and I have both shared today. I know people have been asking for that on the chat. Do keep in touch with us, follow us on social media, or go and look at the website. Be aware that the website's going to be changing over the next couple of weeks, but do use those links to Poetry Line that Farah's put in the chat. That's where you'll find all of those videos that we've shared of poets today, if you want to find them. And you can also read the Reflecting Realities reports on our website as well. But be really good if you've got the chat open to think about now what it is that you might take away. Nicola's already said she wants to do some CPD for the whole staff. She wants everyone to share in her own excitement and enthusiasm following that. Oh, thanks so much, Nicola. Claire's saying got a lot of more work to do on embedding poetry and widening staff knowledge of that range of diverse and new poets. Thank you very much as well, Claire. Hannah, thinking teachers in general be better poetry teachers if they're poetry writers and poetry readers. Absolutely, that's the messaging that's come through every bit of poetry research that we've done today. Thank you so much, ladies. Really glad you've enjoyed it. If you haven't had chance to put those things in the chat, do just write them down in your notebook and think about what are the key actions that you're going to take following this session today. Lisa's talked about finding out about poets she hasn't come across before, and that process of writing poetry using those ideas. Fantastic. She said she's providing CPD for staff. If your staff do want any more CPD on poetry or indeed on reflecting realities, Farah and I are both running reflecting realities and poetry webinars this term. The poetry webinars are next week actually, and the reflecting realities, you've got another one this week, haven't you, Farah? And there's another picture books webinar as well. But we've also got poet Matt Goodfellow, whose poem The Day you heard in today's session, doing a face-to-face course with us next March. Fingers crossed if we all get to being face-to-face training by next March in the centre as well. So if you do want any support with that CPD, do look at the other things that we've got on offer at CLPE. But all it leaves me to say now is thank you for listening to Farah and I this afternoon. Thank you for your lovely comments in the chat as well, and really hope that the session has been useful in moving your thinking forward, both on creating that spine of text that reflects your children's realities and on how to embed poetry in your primary classrooms as well. Thanks very much, and thanks to Helen and Ruth for facilitating the session.
Thank you hugely, Charlotte and Farah, for being with us today. Thank you for the previous session. There's so much ground that you covered today, so many inspirational ideas. I hope you're feeling the love in the chat. I can feel that colleagues have got such a lot out of this session, so thank you so much. Thank you, colleagues, for engaging. Hope you found it useful. I have posted a link to the feedback form in the chat, and I'm hoping that you'll have had that emailed to you as well. Your feedback's really important to us, and the feedback form does review the whole year in terms of our network meetings and what we've done this year. So please do give us the feedback in terms of informing how we create the programme for you next academic year. So I'm going to say no more, but a huge thank you. Thank you for leaving us on a real high for our last session of the year. Charlotte, Ruth, have you got anything to say before we end?
I've got loads to say, but I know people are going to want to rush off. In fact, my husband's been baking a cake this afternoon, so I've just been sat here smelling freshly baked cake. So I'm sure people want to go, not because it hasn't been a fabulous session. What I love about it is it all relates to our roles. You know, you can't be an English leader with such a challenging curriculum without being passionate about children learning language and using language expressively. And this is about loving what we do and trying to get everybody on board in the school to love it as much as we do. So phrases like Farah's phrase, the collective consciousness of the staff room, I loved, because actually, is there a collective consciousness about this in your staff room? What work have we got to do to make sure everybody feels like we do about poetry and language development? Farah talking about books as a renewable resource. As a group, we're always talking about how we make sure books can be replenished and refreshed. Well, there was just tons. It was absolutely brilliant. I stopped making notes during the poetry bit because I was too busy listening to all those beautiful poems. And I do want to say to people, because I flag up the CLPE Award regularly, if you're worried and overwhelmed by how many poets you might not know, I always go to CLPE shortlists because they are inevitably brilliant. In fact, coincidentally, I have this book by my side. It's usually by my side because I absolutely love it. The winner this year, Cherry Moon, was extraordinary.
Oh, I think we've lost Ruth, but I can finish her sentence probably. The winner, Cherry Moon, was extraordinary. It was a brilliant celebration of nature poetry, which again is a perfect collection to study now. Our new shortlist will be out on July the 19th. And if you'd like to sign up your school for the shadowing scheme, you can do that via our website too. If you'd like to submit your children performing videos of poems for submission to the shadowing scheme and the chance to win the chance to perform at the awards ceremony next year. I think that's probably what Ruth was going to say, Helen.
Seamless, absolutely seamless. We'll leave it there, colleagues, and we'll let you go, and look forward to seeing you next year, if not before. But thank you so much again, Charlotte and Farah, and thank you, colleagues. See you soon. Bye-bye.